If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this.
Night owls, late night shifters, and those who take midnight walks in the woods or outdoors, what creepy or scary paranormal thing have you seen in the dead of night?
What did I see in the forest? Every summer my family and relatives rent a cabin in different parts of Sweden, and it has always been wonderful weeks. But this one time when I was about 10 or 12 years old, I saw something that still sticks with me 13 years later. We rented a cabin in the upper south of Sweden, far away from any neighbors or cities. We were staying up late one night playing cards, and I had just gotten a laser pen from my grandpa. Around 12 or 1 in the middle of the night, I went outside to see how far my pen could reach into the forest. I was standing on the grass, a few steps away from the cabin and a few steps away from the tree line. It was a full moon, and I was not at all afraid or feeling creeped out by the dark forest. Instead, I just stood there playing with the laser. But suddenly I just got a really bad feeling, a mixture of true fear and of being watched. I looked around, but it was just me there until I saw a white face with black hollow eyes among the trees. Even though the eyes were black holes, I could see it was looking at me as it passed by like it was walking very fast, but its face was turned to me. It had a black, hooded long cape and long black hair hanging down under the hood. It was really tall, like 2.5 or 3 meters, and moved inhumanly fast. Also, the silence was so loud. It made no sound when I should have heard branches snapping and leaves rustle while it moved, but nothing. I just froze when I saw it and didn't know if I actually saw what I saw. But I did not want to find out if it was real or not, so I just ran back inside and did not go out at night alone again. I have no idea what it was I saw. But I have never seen the same thing again. I remembered it when I heard a story of someone seeing a pale face with black hair in a lake. I tried drawing it, but it did not turn out that good, so I don't know if it helps or makes my story more clear. Does anyone know what it could have been, or has anyone had similar encounters or sightings? My grandpa's childhood encounter. Hello. I have been a listener for a long time, but this is my first time sharing. Deciding to share one story, I remember my grandpa telling me. He has since passed away, so I can't ask him any details, unfortunately, but I will share what I remember here. My grandpa grew up in an extremely rural area of the North Georgia mountains. He was, according to his estimate, about 8 to 9 years old when this happened in the late 1930s, and it happened on his family farm. Now, he was a very religious man, but when he told this story, it was like he couldn't help but feel it was something supernatural. At this time in his area, they didn't have any electricity and no indoor bathroom. They had an outhouse some distance from the house, which meant at night you would have to walk in the dark to use it. Well, one night he got up and had to pee, and when it was nighttime you generally didn't walk all the way to the outhouse to pee, you just did it right outside the house. This is what he told me at least, lol. Well, he started doing his business near the back door of the house, and then he looked to the side, near a big tree they had behind the house, and saw what he described as a white, glowing, ethereal, dog-like creature or perhaps apparition. He said he just stared at it, and it stared back at him until he finished and then promptly ran back into the house. I guess he never told anybody about it until later in life. But it always gives me a chill thinking about it, even for such a small encounter. I know a lot of weird stuff is known to happen in Appalachia, and I wonder if anyone could shed some light on what they think it could have been? Potential demon in my dorm. I have been a skeptic for most of my life, but I've had a few potentially paranormal encounters. There is one that really freaks me out that I can't seem to justify. I'd like to know what your thoughts are. When I was 18, I lived in Savannah, Georgia, for college, a notoriously haunted city. I was up late one night, maybe 1 to 2 a.m., listening to music and just chilling. Suddenly, I see a tall, skinny, shadowy figure walk from the bathroom to my roommate's door. It wasn't a quick glance or anything like that, I was staring at it for a few seconds. I got really freaked out but stayed put because I figured maybe I was just seeing things. A few moments later, I start hearing a deep voice speaking to me in tongues. I understood what it was saying, the gist of it was that it could help me if I ever needed anything. I started picturing a Bullman hybrid that wouldn't leave my mind. I got really freaked out and told it to go away, and it did. I didn't know what to do, so I bought a crystal that's supposed to be for protection, and that seemed to work. Important to mention that prior to this experience I was waking up with bruises all over my legs and arms, I had seen dishes fly off the drying rack, and I and all my roommates had gotten a really creepy vibe from the bathroom. Sometimes we would hear the water turn on in the shower, and when we would go to check, the floor would be wet, but the faucet was off. The lights would also turn on and off by themselves. I've never had auditory hallucinations before, or hallucinations in general. Also, The other times I've seen ghosts, I wasn't scared, but this time I was. I still can't figure out what that could have been because it was a very elaborate experience, and I have a hard time believing I just made it all up. Also, 2/3 of my roommates reported a similar figure, one before me that I forgot about and one after. I didn't tell her what I saw until she told me what happened to her, as I didn't want to scare her. Any thoughts about what the figure I saw/heard could have been? I think IT saw me too. So this happened about a year back. I was standing on my balcony around 3 a.m. at night, smoking a cigarette. I was facing the window, and in the window, I saw a reflection of something sitting on the rooftop of the building opposite across the street. I turned around, and there was nothing. I continued smoking, and as I looked up at the roof again, I saw a dark figure sitting on the ledge of the building. It wasn't sitting normally, kind of like how Spider-Man sits on a light pole, like it was hunting for something. I kept looking at it, trying to figure out what it was and if it's really what I think it is, or am I just sleep deprived? After like half a minute of me staring, I felt like it looked back at me, and I just kept staring at it, and I was completely lost. It was a little dark, but I'm certain this thing had almost human-like features, but in the most ducked-up way imaginable. A skin that kind of looked burnt, and I'm sure it didn't have eyeballs, just 2 empty eye sockets. When I realized, I immediately turned my head down. Just a second later I looked up again, and it was gone. I went inside, drank some water, and heard a scream coming from somewhere nearby. I went to my balcony again, and the screaming didn't stop. It sounded like a woman, but there were no breaks in the scream. It was a continuous loud scream. Me being an idiot, I went downstairs and started walking towards the sound. The road was dimly lit, and not a soul in sight. I walked and walked, I think about 500 meters in, and I realized that the sound was exactly like it was from my balcony. It should have been louder, much louder, but it was exactly the same. So I kept walking towards the sound, and I walked for a while and still didn't get any louder. Every once in a while I would forget that I'm walking or even where, and just keep walking, and then I would snap back. And at this point I realized I had come quite far from my house to an almost barren area. I started walking back towards my house, and the screaming didn't stop. It was an extremely eerie scream, almost human but not quite. Humans breathe while screaming, but whatever it was, it didn't. It's almost like I was drawn towards it. I reached home and opened a can of beer and, after a while, went to sleep. I woke the next morning and went to that rooftop to see if I could find something. I first inspected the spot I first saw in the reflection and then the ledge, and nothing. I used baby powder and a transparent tape to see if I could get a fingerprint or find any cells in the sample, but I found nothing. Now here's the thing. I don't believe in ghosts or paranormal, at all. I honestly still don't because I'm a scientist. But I cannot for the life of me find an explanation for this incident. It never haunts me, I didn't lose any sleep over it, but I still wonder what it could have been. I know I wasn't seeing things, I wasn't drunk or high. The reason I'm sharing this story after a year is because, 3 days ago, I was sitting with my friends, and we were sharing weird things that we hadn't told anyone about. I shared this incident with them, and they were scared shitless. Especially because they know that I'm the kind of guy who laughs at someone who claims they saw a ghost or even someone who believes in one. A friend told me that she didn't sleep that night after going home and recommended this channel to ask people what they think it was. So, what was it? I've never really told this story before, but back whenever I was 18 years old, I used to have this group of 3 friends, R&T, that I used to spend almost every single day with. We would alternate whose houses we slept over at. 2 of us lived in the city, but one of us lived on a big property in the middle of nowhere in North Texas. This property was surrounded by farms and a forested area. We would typically end up sleeping over at ours house because we enjoyed making a campfire and just generally exploring at night. Sometimes we would go out coyote hunting with their stepdad, but we never had any weird experiences or anything, so we just continued to mindlessly explore the surrounding properties. One night we decided to go coyote hunting like we had multiple times before, and so we went out with both R&T, our stepdad, stepsister who was 11 at the time, and their mother. Everything was normal. We were in a little wooded area, and I was kind of far behind everybody. I was with the stepsister at this point, so we were both just hanging out probably 15 to 20 feet behind everybody else, and all of a sudden I got the worst feeling, like I was in immediate danger, and I got a very strong feeling that I should turn around, so I turned around, and there's this almost humanoid looking figure standing about 20 feet away from us, and it looks like it's crouching. Then I see it stand up straight, and it looks like it's 6 or 7 feet tall, and I start to panic. Still, I didn't want to freak out the kid, so I continued to look at it and walk backward towards the group of people that were there with me and bump into R, whose property was on, and say, What the duck is that thing? My friend turns around and gets this panic look on their face and says we need to go right now. At this point, the little sister is freaking out, so I'm trying to console her, and I turn around, and it's gone, so we get the group together, and we start quickly walking back the almost mile walk home on the way back. When we told the other friend what was going on, he said that he thought it was a Wendigo. I had a horrible, eerie feeling for the rest of the night, and I was not able to fall asleep, and I still get a very eerie feeling thinking about that night. I've done a lot of research since then, and I haven't been able to find anything about Wendigos in North Texas. I'm 21 years old now, and I can still picture it like it happened yesterday. I have no idea what it was that I saw. A few nights ago I almost left my window open after dark, and it reminded me of this story, so I wanted to tell it. I still have no clue what the dog creature was, and I was hoping for some insight. Firstly, I'd like to give some information about how my bedroom and house are set up so everything makes a little more sense. My room is set up like a square. My bedroom door is tucked in the bottom right corner with my bed up against the opposite corner, with the foot of the bed facing towards the top of the square. In the front of the square, there are 2 windows at the foot of my bed with maybe a yard of wiggle room so I can walk to my door. Last year was really rough for me, though, and my room was incredibly messy, so the only way I could get to my door was to hop off the foot of my bed and walk past both windows to leave my room. Under the 2 windows in my room is a small roof covering a room from the first floor. The roofing extends a foot past the room's walls on all sides, and there is no way to get to this roof unless you went through my windows. There is no way to get on top of my house at all. No trees, no fence, no ladders, nothing. Last year I was up late at night listening to music. It was almost 12 a.m., and it was completely dark outside, with the only light in my room being from a shitty lamp I've had since I was a kid. In order for me to be able to sleep, I have to have my fan on, otherwise, I'll overheat and be really uncomfortable. Because my fan is always on, sometimes loose papers on my floor will flap around, so I'll just get up and move them so I don't have to listen to it. That night, though, I heard a noise that didn't sound like paper coming from the foot of my bed. I was confused and paused my music to listen. It got louder, and I looked to where the noise was coming from. There was nothing on the ground, but when I looked up, a visceral fear that I had never felt before ran through me. At first I thought it was a dog outside my window, or a fox, but it was too unnatural. It was peeking into my window, and I could see its head and its pure, white, unblinking eyes. That creature was the thing causing the noise, which I realized was scratching on the metal mesh outside my window. We stared at each other. It was huge. The creature started walking along both of my windows, scratching along the metal until it disappeared off to the side. Its back looked similar to a porcupine. I can't even describe it. It was just sharp and dangerous and made my breath hitch. I waited a few minutes, and thinking it was gone, I started inching towards the foot of my bed so I could get the hell out of my room. It walked back across, scratching the mesh, before sitting at the window in front of me and just staring at me. It paced between my windows for a bit before walking off to the side and disappearing, keeping those white eyes on me the entire time. Once I knew it was gone, I kept my eyes on the window at all times and backed out of my room. I sprinted down the hall to tell my parents, who were very disinterested, and that was that. I walked back into my room and kept the lights on as I cried and just stared at my windows. I've slept with my lamp on since then. A few months later, I had to move schools. That's where I met Ally. We bonded quickly and became really good friends. 7 months into our friendship, she opened up to me about her paranormal experience and how she thinks she has some things that follow her around. She told me a lot of stories, but the last one made me stop. Ally started complaining about this dog that she's seen a few times across her life and how it freaks her out. Before then I had never told anyone about the creature I saw outside my window, but she described it perfectly. After she finished, I opened up about how I saw the exact same thing, and since then, I've been trying to help her with her spiritual attachments. I've always dealt with paranormal stuff, and I'm very spiritual, so nothing usually phases me. I've been dragged out of my bed by the leg when a spirit was screaming at me. I've been woken up in the middle of the night by a spirit trying to talk to me. I see auras around people, etc. But this was a rare occasion that something genuinely freaked me out. Ally is dealing with some demonic stuff. Like, I'm talking scary demonic stuff. She resides on native land, specifically the Wampanoag tribal land, and has encountered some of their supernatural creatures in the past. Given that my town also has Native American roots, I can't help but wonder if the dog could be of native descent. Maybe it was scoping me out before I met her since I've helped her manage the supernatural stuff in her life? I have no clue. If anyone has insight, please let me know. Something was on my back porch last night. It was not human. So, I have been debating if I should post about this, but I am starting to get really freaked out and figured it could hurt asking for help. Now I will warn you all that English is not my first language. I am French Canadian but moved to the US about 3 years ago. So I live in a pretty rural area in Michigan close to the lake, and I am currently living alone. Both my parents are now in Canada, taking care of my great uncle, who is in his late 80s, and they have been gone for a month or so and probably won't be back until late December. I am 19, so more than old enough to be alone. But some really odd things have been happening in the last 2 weeks, so it started back in September when my 15-year-old cat Gingersnap went missing. At first I figured she had passed away, since she was very old and had a few health problems already. And a few days later I found her body completely torn to shreds on my back porch. I mean, she was severely mutilated to the point where I threw up while sobbing hysterically. I came to the conclusion that I must have been a bird of prey, since we have so many big owls and hawks where I live. A few days passed, and on October the 4th, something odd also happened. I was watching TV around 11 p.m., and I kept hearing a really fast knocking sound. It would come in sets of 5 and then stop for a second and then restart. I ended up going outside to investigate, and I couldn't see anyone, but there was a really ducking horrible smell. Then what happened last night was that I had woken up at like 3 a.m., which happens sometimes if I have a really messed up dream. So I walked down the hall to get a drink and probably watch TV. When I got to the fridge, which is right next to the back porch door, I heard someone walking around. I froze up, coming and staying completely still. I looked over to the door and saw a huge shadow. It was kind of crouched on its hands. I don't really think it saw me, but it looked human. It didn't move for like a whole 3 minutes before the shadow moved in the blink of an eye, and it was just gone. I ran back to my room and called the cops. When they got there, they couldn't find anything but told me there was no one, that it was a person since our back porch is suspended about 15 feet in the air, and there was no ladder. I am super freaked out, especially since I am completely alone up here. I don't know much about the supernatural, outside of the standard werewolves and vampires, so any tips would be deeply appreciated. So, maybe 6 weeks ago or so, I went to leave my friend's house and walk home. The night was pitch black, the moon was hardly visible, and it was late. While outside his house, I dig out my cigarettes, pull one out, and light it. Before walking away, I hear a reasonably loud whistle, which I would guess came from the trees near a friend's fence line. Just a guess, as I know the layout well in the light. I look around at nothing in particular so as not to draw unwanted attention, as I've read stories on here about not responding to it. So I begin to walk, maybe a total of about a half mile or so. I am certain that the distance is less than 1 mile. On one stretch of road, which is the majority of the distance, it proceeded to follow me. 2 whistles came from behind me in the dark, and the third one came in front of me, I'd say 30 yards in front of me, but up in some people's yard. That was where I had to turn right and head towards my place. From that point on, no more whistling. As a geographical standpoint, I live in a small town in Arizona that is very secluded, surrounded by national forest, maybe 10 miles or so to the Apache reservation as the crow flies, and full of history of a very peculiar nature. I would imagine I am going to get several replies of it being a skinwalker, as was my first guess. But I'm a white guy with no known reason that I can think of to be targeted by such a creature. Unless maybe it was bored? I don't know, but what do you all think? When I was 5 years old, my family lived in an apartment that had once served as a resting place for travelers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The building had an old, lingering presence, and it wasn't uncommon for my mother to share unsettling stories. She once told my brother and me that, during a barbecue party in the garden, she had seen strange faces peering through my bedroom windows. My brother refused to use the bathroom at night, claiming he heard strange noises and saw shadows moving in the dim light beneath his bedroom door. One night, something happened to me that I will never forget. I woke up suddenly, startled by the sound of a man's voice calling out, "Hello, hello," over and over. The voice was unfamiliar, and as I opened my eyes, I saw him, standing right above me, bent over, staring straight into my eyes. The sight of him froze me in terror. He looked like Nosferatu but without the exaggerated ears, bald, gaunt, and impossibly old. But the most horrifying detail was that he wasn't standing on the ground. He was floating. He drifted backward, hovering toward the entrance of my bedroom, and in a soft but urgent whisper, he beckoned, "Follow me, come, come." Against all reason, I found myself getting out of bed and following him. He led me across the small hall and into my parents' bedroom, which was right next to mine. I stood frozen in their doorway as the figure floated silently toward their bed. He extended a long arm, pointing directly at their sleeping heads, and in a hoarse voice, he commanded, "Look! Look!" That's when the terror took over. I let out a scream, louder than I thought possible, and broke into uncontrollable sobs. The fear I felt was unlike anything I had ever known, raw, primal, shaking me to the core. My parents jolted awake, startled by my cries. The moment they stirred, the figure vanished without a trace. Through my tears and panicked breaths, I could only yell, "The vampire!" The vampire was here. This was no dream. I've revisited that night countless times, and the vividness of the memory, along with other strange experiences in that house, has always confirmed to me that what I saw was real. My family and I returned home from our vacation, and it was late at night. We were unloading the car in different places in our front yard. I was on our porch, and my husband and 2 children were in the process of getting bags from the car in our driveway when our dog started to bark. We all simultaneously looked towards him, and then in the direction of his view, we all 4 very clearly saw a shadow figure of what appeared to be an old man in a hat, kinda like a railroad conductor vibe, walking from the front of our yard to the back. Our dog followed but would not go into the dark backyard. We all stared at each other in disbelief, agreeing on the details. I did my own lighting test to see if we had actually seen a real shadow of someone, but the lighting and the position/location where this took place were not in alignment for that. 4 people. We all saw the same thing. It sat at the foot of my bed. 2 years ago, in early March 2022, to be exact, I was putting something away in my parents' room when I had a sudden feeling of dread. My dad was in there asleep, and I felt the need to pray over him. I did and asked God to protect him. Later that night, I had a weird dream. In my dream I had just finished washing and drying my bed sheets. I was attempting to straighten the bedsheet out by doing that flapping thing we all do when we hold the ends and lift it up and down. I did that multiple times until it landed on a human form sitting at the end of my bed. Obviously, I was freaked out and quickly snatched the bedsheet off in fear and was met with a pale-like creature. Its face was sunken in, along with its eyes. It was pasty and thin. It looked frail, and I could see its ribs through its thin skin. Its mouth looked sewn shut, and it struggled to breathe through its bony nose. I tried to pray it away, and it glared at me with its sunken eyes until I eventually awakened. My heart was beating out of my chest, and that feeling of dread returned. The next day my dad had to go to work, but he didn't feel well. I advised him to stay home as I felt something was wrong, but he went anyways. He's stubborn. He returned home after work, where he went to bed early without eating. The man loves food, so him not eating isn't normal. The next morning he said his back and stomach were hurting badly. I told him to go to the hospital right away as I had a terrible feeling. The dream kept coming back to my mind, and the thing I saw looked like a physical representation of sickness to me. After some convincing, he went to the trauma hospital around the corner. We live in the medical district. Thank God he went because he had experienced an aortic dissection. An aortic dissection is deadly if not treated in a timely manner. It's a tear in the inner layer of the body's main artery. One basically bleeds out on the inside, depriving the vital organs of oxygen and blood flow. My best friend had one, and he had a less than 5% survival rate as he bled out for 3 days before surgery. He survived, which is a medical miracle. Due to staying by his side almost the whole time he was hospitalized, which was over 100 days, I'm well versed in the condition, surgeries, and long recovery period. My dad was blessed as his was found much earlier. His surgery was successful, though long. He only stayed in the hospital for the whole month of March. The surgeon said his recovery was the fastest he had ever witnessed. It was a terrifying situation. Especially that thing I saw. It was a warning, I guess, a very, very creepy warning. Saw a weird figure walking on the road. So, the thing is, my dad works in the forces, so he's in an outpost, and I live with my elder brother and mom. But I am currently living in my aunt's house for a few weeks as my mom and bro are in the native. The place where my aunt lives is kind of semi-urban or, say, a tiny town. I usually don't do much except study in the house. I still go out for walks in the evening or at night so that I can talk with my girlfriend in secrecy. Now, as it's a small town, there is plenty of space and vast empty landscapes too, and usually very few or no people are on the road after 10 p.m. I walk late at night as my uncle, a store owner, closes very late and comes around 11 to 11:30 p.m. at home. Cut to the story. One night I was normally walking on the roads near the house. The roads are in a grid pattern, and street lights are good but not very regularly placed. Street dogs are harmless to people, and they only fight amongst each other. Now, I was walking for quite a while, also on the phone with my GF2, it was around 11 p.m. I was 500 meters away from the house and was going towards it when I started to notice that the dogs were all standing still as if they saw a predator, and I noticed it too, so I started faster towards my house when I reached a crossroad. At that point, when I looked to my left on the road, I saw that thing. Around 50 to 70 meters away and completely black and moving very slowly like a zombie or Ike. I don't believe in supernatural things, but when I saw it, its back was towards me, and it was walking away. I thought I might be misjudging it due to poor light, so I even stood and waited to see what it was till it reached below the streetlight. I saw it from the back, and I still couldn't understand what it was. It was completely black even under direct light, a weird body figure thin and deformed like a zombie, and its clothes were really not distinguishable, a completely black figure like a shadow. After observing it for a good 30-odd seconds, I decided to move towards my home, and I went across the crossroad, and the figure was on the road going to the left of me. I walked straight towards my aunt's house and never told anything about it after that. I, 18, female, live by a forest line in the Clinton River in Michigan, so it's not unusual to have wildlife like deer and coyotes running around. I sometimes sit and watch them, but one night, around 2 years ago, I was looking out my window at night, and I saw a deer about 50 feet away by the fence line, and I was just watching it, and it turned to look at me, stood up on its hind 2 legs with its shoulders back, and started swinging its arms while walking towards me. I know deer sometimes stand up on their hind 2 legs, but this was extremely unnatural looking. Its shoulders were completely back like a human's while swinging its arms, like a human walks. A year or so goes by, and the auditory things start happening. It sounds like a woman speaking over an intercom system, but it's right outside my house, and it's always incomprehensible but audible, if that makes sense. These happen about once a month. The next encounter happened about a month ago, when I was getting ready for work around 6 a.m. It was dark out, and I was on FaceTime with a girlfriend, and I saw a headless deer just standing there by the fence line again, and I flipped the camera, and my friend saw it too, which confirmed it's not just me hallucinating. Last night is when things got way too weird for me. I was coming home from my boyfriend's house, and while I was walking from my car to the door, about 15 feet, I stopped to throw something in the garbage bin, and I looked up to the fence line maybe 40 feet away from me, and I saw a huge mass with glowing whitish yellow eyes and ginormous antlers. The thing was the size of a moose. I stare at it, trying to comprehend what I'm looking at for maybe 10 seconds, and it starts charging at me. It starts running around the other side of the fence to try to get to me, and it's fast. I run to the door and start fumbling for my keys, and it's about 10 feet away on the other side of the car by the time I slam and lock the door. I go to my second-story bedroom to try and calm down, and the intercom lady, as I like to call her, starts talking to me again. This time I catch it on recording, which I forgot to save to the camera roll after sending to friends, and make sure other people can hear it too. It says things to me like "come outside," and the rest is incomprehensible as it usually is. I couldn't sleep all night and don't know what to do. It's never been aggressive enough or caught me outside at the same time. Does anyone know what I'm dealing with or what I can do to prevent it? So this literally just happened last night, and I'm not really sure if it's paranormal, but it's still pretty creepy. So my room is up against the front side of my house on the second story, and there is a window facing the front yard right next to my bed. I'm sitting there reading a book with my lamp on when I start hearing my name outside. In the beginning, it was too quiet to notice, but then it got louder. I was really confused because it sounded like my old neighbor, who just moved out but visited that same day, because it sounded like an 11-year-old boy's voice, although it sounded off from my old neighbor. I was confused, though, because he had visited my house that day and had already left to go back to his house in another town, plus it was really late at night for him to be trying to get me to go outside. I could tell from the tone of voice that whoever it was trying hard to get someone's attention. But right when I paid attention to the voice and thought all of this, the voice stopped, and I realized that my shadow was being projected onto the window because of the lamp. I looked out the window and didn't see anyone there, but I heard as if someone was opening and closing the downstairs window on that side. I went downstairs and checked with my sisters, who were watching TV. I asked them if the TV was loud or if they heard someone calling my name, to which both of them replied that the TV was actually quite quiet. After that, I went into my parents' room to ask them about it. Both of them had been asleep and heard nothing. I just went back to sleep at that point, and nothing else happened. The thing is, this isn't the first time I've heard voices at that window. Years ago, when my house was severely haunted, I was opening the blinds in the morning and heard a woman whisper right into my ear, "Good night." I could even feel breath on my ear. I smiled because I thought it was my mom messing with me and saying good night when it was morning. I turned around with a smile, and my smile immediately disappeared from my face. There was nobody in my room. Everyone else was either across the hall or downstairs completely. Plus, I didn't hear anyone come or leave. Any ideas? Whistling outside my garden at 2 a.m. So it was around 1:50 a.m., staying up late when I heard whistling call noises. Like those straight out of a movie. I heard it the first time and didn't think much of it, as I thought it was my brother-in-law. Not long after, I heard the exact same whistling calls. At this point I thought it was my brother-in-law calling for my sister, as it was late and she was showering. But the thing is, my brother-in-law was in the shower, and my sister was in her room. The whistling call came again. It was loud enough for it to sound like it came right next to my room, although it was coming from outside. I put my phone down to listen if the whistle would come up again. And as I wait, the whistle call changes. This time it was a 1-second whistle. Imagine someone whistling, but instead it stops immediately after making noise. That's what it was. Creeped out, I messaged my sister asking if my brother-in-law was whistling, but she tells me he's in the shower. My sister then tells me that she also hears the whistling and thought it was me instead. After what seemed like 10 minutes without hearing the whistle, my heart dropped as the whistling call from the beginning played again. I and my sister hurriedly asked each other if we heard the same thing. So my sister peeks out with a light. And no one was there? Even our neighbors were asleep, not in their garden. So we go back to our phones, creeped out and still messaging, as we wait for my brother-in-law. While waiting, we still heard the whistling, but ever since we started hearing them more, the whistles happened at a longer interval. At times it would be the whistle call or the 1-second whistle. Mind you, this was coming from right below outside my garden, and I was on the second floor of the house. Finally, my brother-in-law comes out, my sister tells him about what just happened. So they grab a torch, look outside, and no one is there. They go downstairs, check every door, and turn on the lights. Nobody there. Brother-in-law goes into the garden with a torch, no one is there. To this day we have no clue what that was, and I kind of struggled to sleep that night. Don't look behind you. Summer, 2017. Sometimes at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd go for a run around the neighborhood. I hadn't been doing well mentally, and running was the least destructive activity in my life. One night, I decided I'd run to the local high school. I jogged from my house down the mile stretch of road and ended up at the football stadium. I ran a few laps around the track, then I started up and down the bleachers. I was feeling pretty good until something washed over me. It was the sense that I was being watched.
For a split second, I thought, just keep going, and just as I went to climb the next step, the memory of a story that my grandfather had once told me resurfaced.
One night, when he was 7 or 8, my grandfather woke up to a man staring at him from outside his bedroom window. When he got close to the window, the man leapt down from the second-story ledge. My grandfather said that the man had vanished, but that an elongated animal on 4 very long legs scurried away from the house. He told this story only once, after I'd mocked native legends. I thought it was just an old man's tale. I had forgotten his story until that moment, when chills went through my body, and I knew something was watching me. I wanted more than anything to forget about it so that I could finish my routine, but something within, call it intuition, urged me to leave. That fear was stronger than my thoughts of rationality, as fear tends to be. I called my mom, she answered. I said that I knew it was too late to bother her, that I was sorry, but that something didn't feel right at the stadium. She said, I need you to run home, and whatever you do, keep your eyes in front of you. Don't turn back. I'm going to meet you halfway. Stay on the phone. Do not hang up. I'm coming. I didn't understand why she was as panicked, and I felt awful for bothering her. As I was exiting the stadium gates, my blood ran cold. A man in a wide-rimmed straw hat was leaning against the chain-linked fence that surrounded the campus. He was smiling, this excited smile, one I will never forget. I jogged past him, he nodded at me and said, "Time for fun." I bolted. I didn't look back. I invoked the name of Jesus. I prayed to whatever higher power there was. I asked angels to protect me. I kept running until I saw the headlights of my mom's car. Later, she told me that when people like us have big feelings like that, it's evolutionary, the way prey can sense a predator. She suspects it was a dark creature, one that was drawn to people going through deep depression. From then on, I decided to never run alone after sunset. Summer, 2019. One night, this coworker wanted to go for a run after we got off. We both worked the graveyard shift, so we agreed to go to the track at the high school since it was open and not too far from work. We arrive, chatting, carefree, complaining about work, walking up through the front gates. As we stepped foot onto the track, she stopped and said, "I don't like this place." I froze and looked at her. "Why?" I asked. She just shook her head and whispered, "Something evil lives here." I took her hand immediately, walking us back to the gate and towards the car. I remembered my mom's advice and told her, "Don't look behind you." I hadn't told a soul about my initial experience before that. My coworker said it felt like someone was following right behind us until we got in the car. I never will go back there. Never. Something is crying in my house at night. I live with my husband and 5 children in a ranch-style home. We've been at this place for 5 years now, and our kids range in age from 13 down to 1 year. For the past 3 or 4 months, there's been something in my house that cries at night. It's not my kids or my cats. It's something else. These disturbances typically happen between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Usually what happens is my husband and I are in our living room at night, watching TV and unwinding from the day. All of the children are asleep because they have a 9 p.m. bedtime. Suddenly we will hear the sound of a child crying, and I mean loudly crying, not just whimpers but big sobbing cries. One of us will immediately jump up to go check the kids, as all of my children have had night terrors and typical childhood nightmares at some point. But none of them are ever awake. They're all fully asleep, completely peaceful. This will repeat a few more times until we go to bed. It doesn't happen every single night, maybe only once or twice a week, but it's very disturbing when it does. My 13-year-old has also heard the phantom crying, as she was up late with my husband and me one night on the weekend. Also, my children do not have TVs in their rooms, and their tablets/switches are always off, so it's not a sound coming from anything like that. They're not crying in their sleep either. They are always peaceful and undisturbed, not even moving around when I or my husband goes to check on them. We don't have a baby monitor, so there's no chance of interference coming from one. I do have 2 Siamese cats who make noises that sound exactly like human voices, but they are always in the living room with us at night or sleeping in front of the heater in our kitchen, and I have been able to confirm it's not them. As well as the crying at night, we often hear the sound of doors opening and closing, most often the door to my daughter's bedroom. It makes a specific sound because the door sticks a little, and you have to put some force into opening or closing it. We always go check on the children after we hear this, and all of them are always asleep. My husband also hears these things, so I'm confident I'm not going insane. The only thing even remotely like this that has ever happened to me was when my current 5-year-old was around 2, about 3 years ago and in the same house, and we both heard the sudden and extremely loud sound of what I can only describe as something or someone pretending to cry like a baby. I know that sounds weird, but it's the only way I can describe it. Imagine a grown adult, almost mockingly, pretending to cry like a newborn. That's what it sounded like. It was so loud and frightening that my daughter immediately started screaming in fear, prompting me to pack us into the car and leave the house. We spent the rest of the day at my sister's, and I refused to be alone in the house without my husband for the next couple of days. So, what could this be? A demon? A ghost? I don't really believe in the idea of dead people just hanging around your house for eternity. A mimic? What could this thing want, and how do I get rid of it? My dad bought an 1884 Victorian house with my stepmom when she was pregnant with my younger sister. This was around 13 years ago. Being a history lover, my dad wanted to discover the history of the house and who built it. Turns out it was built by a judge and his wife for their family. I was 12 when we moved in, and I got to pick out my bedroom upstairs. There was one room that stood out to me as the creepiest, coldest, and darkest out of the 4 up there, and I refused to go in there. I even refused to keep the door open. It had a stagnant eeriness to it that made me sick to my stomach. Every night, I would wake up at 3 a.m., and somehow, the door would be partially open just enough that a small child could fit through it. I'd shake it off as my dad was probably playing a joke on me, as he knew how much that room creeped me out. Well, at 3 a.m., one morning, I woke up, and the light to the stairway turned on. Following that, there were footsteps that came up the stairs. I didn't think much of it, as my dad probably was grabbing something out of one of the other unoccupied rooms. He's an early riser. However, the footsteps stopped, and the light was still on. Later in the morning, my dad asked me why I left the light on in the stairwell, and I said, "Why did you leave the light on in the stairwell?" "I heard you come upstairs." He said he didn't come upstairs, and I believed him. During our conversation, I reminded him to stop leaving the door to the creepy room open. He swears he didn't, and as a dad would say, why would I open a door to a room no one is in and waste heat and money like that? This makes sense. He has no reason to open the door. This is an old, poorly insulated house that he was renovating, and it took a lot of heat and money to keep it warm. About a year later, it was late, and I fell asleep on the couch downstairs, so I got up to go to my room. When I got to the top of the stairs, I noticed the door to the creepy room was open. Tired and annoyed at this point, I went to close it but froze when I saw a hand on the doorframe and a little white face of a little girl. Just as quickly as I saw her, she vanished. As my dad continued to renovate the house, I guess it stirred things up because we could be sitting in the dining room, and we could hear little footsteps above us, running? Dancing? Around the creepy room that was directly above the dining room. A few years later, we discovered that the judge and his wife, who built the house, had a daughter who died in some kind of accident. She was only 9 when she died. I haven't seen her since, but to this day, I still refuse to go into that room. My encounters with a shadow figure. I heard this was a good place to share something like this, and the people I mention it to find it interesting, so I might as well post it. It started about 1.5 years ago. I had just moved somewhere new. My family is military, so it's not uncommon for my family to move. We were put in an apartment complex as per usual, but a few nights in, I was watching TV with my siblings, and I felt a presence enter the window. I looked, but it's closed and locked, and my siblings were on the other side of me. Then I felt the presence again, but by the door on the other side of the room from the window, and the door was actually moving a little when I looked. I dismissed this. About 2 weeks after, we were moved to a house not too far from the apartment. The first few nights, I slept on an air mattress. I would sleep in the room alone, but I could hear steady breathing right next to me every once in a while. I checked, and it wasn't a hole in the air mattress. That continued even after I got a non-air mattress. It only happened at night, and I tried to find a cause but never found one. A few weeks in, I learned to disregard it, but one night, I saw a figure in the corner of my room, staring at me. I was terrified. The next morning, I rationalized it as sleep paralysis, as I would have acted if I had seen someone in the corner of my room. I didn't see them again for a few days, until I decided to go for a walk in the nearby woods that surrounded my neighborhood. I saw the figure I saw in the corner of my room. After getting closer, they vanished. The next night, they appeared in the corner of my room again, same as before, but this time they approached me, and I watched them stare at me from my bedside. I reacted the same as I did last time, by doing nothing and being terrified. I dismissed it as sleep paralysis the next morning again and moved on, but the next night, they stood over my bed again, and then they reached for my face. As soon as they touched me, I felt fear and terror unlike anything I had ever felt before. I woke up, it was about halfway through the night, but the feelings of fear and terror didn't leave me. Despite waking up, I turned on my light and did not sleep the rest of the night. It took about an hour before I finally calmed down, and when I was getting dressed for school, I had scars on the front and back of both of my shoulders. They weren't there the previous night. And they looked somewhat fresh but also clean, and the clothes I was wearing had no blood stains on them. The scars looked like claw marks, and I actually have those scars to this day. I was never attacked by an animal with claws the size of the scars. I have no idea what really happened, but I haven't been bothered by them since then, and I have heard similar stories around my neighborhood. It might be haunted. Who knows, but all the stories I've heard were similar in terms of the figure being a shadow figure and just watching until they don't. As far as I've heard, the figure only injured me physically. Most of the time, it knocked something down before leaving. Well, there is my story. What do you all think? I'm not terrified anymore, but the fact I have visible physical injuries that I can't really explain aside from sharing this story ticks me off. There's a monster near my house. This happened minutes ago today on September 6th at 11:40 p.m. I take night walks, and usually nothing happens, well, besides today when I gave a frog a makeshift burial. Over the road from my house is an airstrip with a huge field. So it's normal to see the local wildlife roaming around and eating the wild plants and mice. Now the only creatures I've seen are many animals in that field, foxes, deer, and I even saw the neighbor's dog in that field when they forgot to call him back to their home. The dog's name is Spike, and he's a chocolate lab if I'm remembering correctly. So with my earbuds in my ears playing my music on low, I kept my eyes peeled for any animals in the field. Ready to snap a photo for my friends and family, and in the corner of my eye, I saw a pale figure dart into the middle of the field. Like the moron I am, I shined my phone's flashlight at it. What I saw chilled me. It looked like a skinny man. No, emaciated is the proper term. It plunged into the tall grass before I could see its face, but I know that its eyes were pitch black. What got me was its hands. It only had 3 fingers. As if the other 2 were gnawed off. That's when my memory kicked in. My elder, Eleanor, told me of a creature similar to what I saw. Reikinu, translated to English, means child eater. They were human before a deadly plague consumed their minds and transformed them into malicious cannibals. When this popped in my mind, I ran to my home and locked the door. My reaction was triggered by the fact that my younger sister was downstairs. I'm not losing my sister to something like that. At least the damn things don't know how to unlock doors. I and my friend went to a forest at night. This happened only a week ago from me writing this, and I still remember every detail. I and my friend, who for this story I'll call Mark, decided that we would have a sleepover. Mark lives about 10 minutes away from my house, so we decided to meet halfway and then go back to my house. I and Mark eventually got a bit bored at around 3 p.m. and decided to go out and come back later. Next to mine and Mark's school is a big field split into 3 areas. One is for my school, another is for a football club, and the last is just a random field. On the football field are 2 containers and is usually a great hangout spot for friends. One corner of the field has a large forest, so while at the containers, we decided to go later that night and walk around it for a creepy but fun experience. At around 11 p.m. we eventually snuck out of my house and started walking to the forest. On the way to the forest was scary enough. We both live in quite a small town, and at night it gets very eerie and dark, especially when around alleyways or low light areas. We eventually arrived at the forest, and to get in, we had to climb a small gate as it was locked after a certain time. After climbing over into the forest, we started walking around, and yes, we did have a torch, but it was on our phones, so it wasn't that good. After walking around for a few minutes, it felt fairly normal. Yes, it was creepy being in a dark forest alone at night, but nothing was really happening, yet. It had been about 5 minutes, and now we were hearing things, like footsteps when we were standing still or leaves and sticks crunching around us. The air felt warm, but we heard a strong wind. It gave a weird feeling. Throughout all this I felt like I was being watched, and I think Mark felt the same as he kept looking around him. We decided to stand still for a minute and listen for anything, as we now thought something was off. After a minute or two of standing still, we both hear a loud, quick movement as if something started running in front of us. We ran away after hearing that, but we didn't leave. We were still in the forest, but now we could see the gate in case we had to run out and climb over. Turns out we did. I kept seeing something moving around between the trees. Mark said he was hearing what he thought might be whistling. Now we were very creeped out, but it soon got a lot creepier. Both I and Mark saw something behind a tree but couldn't properly see what it was, and then we saw a silhouette of a person peeking around the tree and staring through our bodies. I and Mark ran and quickly climbed over the gate. After a few minutes of standing in front of the forest gate and listening, I came up with an idea that gets most people killed in movies. I entered the forest alone to see if I could get anything else happening since I was now alone. After only about a minute or two of walking, I heard whistling from the left side of me. As I turned my head, I was faced with pure nightmare fuel. There was a person or thing staring at me only a few steps away from the other side of a bush. To describe in detail what I saw, I would say it had a wide smile with haunting white, cracked eyes. I was now darting towards the gate and then hopped over and even nearly fell from how fast I tried to climb over. Mark asked what happened, and I told him. He was about to say something when we heard a loud cough from inside the forest and very close to us. We ran and turned onto the road we went down to get to the forest. I wish I could conclude this story, but it's not yet finished. We stood down the road looking down, and we saw what looked like 2 people on different sides of the road standing still, staring down at us. We turned around and kept walking, acting like we didn't see anything. But I kept hearing the same usual noises, coughing, whistling, and even laughing. I'm going to skip a few parts, as it's mainly just us being scared and standing still for 10 minutes trying to look and hear anything. But now I see a person crouched behind a public garbage bin. I decided to walk up to it and try see more. Once I was a bit closer, I noticed there was something now waving around, like this person or thing was holding an item and taunting us with it. Then I realized this item was a knife. Mark must have seen it too, as I saw the face on him. Genuine fear. I looked back at the person or thing, and as I looked back, I saw a head pop up over the bin and stare directly into my soul. I and Mark were now running faster than ever. We kept looking behind us, and one of the corners we turned, a person popped out and ran for us. Me and Mark were now getting chased around the dark, empty, silent streets of my town. We eventually got to my house and now weren't being followed. That night was definitely something that'll be in my memory until I die. I just hope that whatever the duck was in there doesn't know where I live. I and Mark might go back to the forest, and I'll keep updating if we do. 3 knocks in the dead of night. So something strange just happened to me and my grandma. We stayed up till just before 4 a.m. tonight watching The Walking Dead. She's never seen it before, so we've been binging until really late so she'll be caught up for the new season. After we turned the TV and all the lights off, she went to her room, and I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth. I was almost done when I heard 3 light knocks right behind me. Now our bathroom is connected to the master bedroom, my grandparents' room. I heard the knocks on that door and assumed it was my grandma coming into the bathroom and just checking if I was in there. I replied, yes, but received no response. So I exited and went to the living room to let my dog out to potty. She then comes out of her room and asks what I wanted. Confused, I asked what she meant. She said she heard me knock. I said, no, I heard you knock, I thought you wanted in the bathroom. She just looked at me. Turns out we both heard 3 quiet, distinct knocks. I heard it on the door to her room, behind me, and she heard it on her bedroom door, which leads to the hallway. We searched the house to make sure no one broke in but found nothing. Does anyone know what this could have been? The knocks came at around 4:10 a.m. She has a deceased son and a son that is missing for almost a year now. Could this be one of them reaching out? Or a death in the family? The only child she has left is my father, and I'm terrified that we may lose him. I also have a very old aunt and uncle, so I'm dreading hearing the phone ring in the coming days. Something knocking at our bedroom door all night, waking us up with a hey in the morning. This happened just a few nights ago. I waited a few more nights before I decided to see if this was some reoccurring, explainable thing. It hasn't happened since, so I feel it's appropriate to share. My fiancé and I were going to bed around 10 or 11 p.m. Our bedroom is in the basement, and our roommate lives upstairs. His schedule is the opposite of ours, so we have become accustomed to him knocking on our door later in the night if he needs anything. Fiancé and I were having our final conversation before drifting off, and we heard a familiar knock at the door. Come in, I say because we're all pretty close, and he knows he's welcome. No one steps through the door, and I say again, come in. Still nothing, so we call his name, and when he doesn't come in the door, I get up and open it. There was no one there. I sat, and we joked briefly about how it's the ghost. Long story short, we've had some other weird experiences, as people often do with an old house, but nothing as weird as what happened this night, and went to bed. Fiancé falls asleep, and I start to drift off. As I'm falling asleep, another knock. This doesn't wake my fiancé up, so I don't say anything and instead get up and decide to investigate the basement a little. Maybe the cat is being a brat, or something is settling. I note that the knocking sounded similar in tempo to the first time it happened, so I wondered if it was some pipes in the walls adjusting to the winter temperatures. I figure, yeah, it must be that, but I couldn't help the feeling that the noise was very obviously knocking against our door. We are very used to the sound, as our roommate very often approaches us that way. I also know what creaking pipes sound like, and this was not that, nor had the pipes ever adjusted that way in previous winters. Well, whatever. It's annoying but no big deal. I go back to bed and actually fall asleep this time. About 30 minutes later, the knocking starts again. Knock knock knock, it could be something settling in the house, but it so obviously sounds like knuckles on the wood of our door. The pattern, the tempo, and the hollow sound of our door. And it is happening at our door. It's not in the walls or the ceiling. We have our laundry room a room away from our bedroom, but our door is so thick that we never hear anything happening out there. It is decidedly weird, but I'm tired and have to work in the morning, so I try my best to ignore it. Every 30 minutes to an hour, the knocking comes back, and with each occurrence, the knock pattern changes. Deliberate knock knocks, swift knock knock knocks, each time I'm trying to ignore it and fall back asleep, only to be jostled awake again. I had lost track of time, but I assume it was early morning when I was shot awake by a knock followed by a male voice saying, "Hey, okay," so this had to have been our roommate. I got up and once again opened the door to find no one. Well, maybe he was messing with us. He has a weird sense of humor. I begrudgingly put on some clothes to go walk around upstairs and find him. Turns out, he's still at work. The house is completely dark, and I'm beginning to feel anxious. I go to the front door and see if someone was knocking there, and there's no one. Of course, if there was someone trying to get in all night, the dog would have been freaking the duck out, but I really had no other explanation. So, I make myself go back to bed. Maybe the pipes are not only shifting to sound like knocking on wood but also creaking to sound like a man calling out. The night goes on, and though the knocking continues, I finally get used to it and actually get a few hours of sleep. At approximately 7 a.m., my fiancé and I abruptly jumped out of bed when we heard a clear hey from outside the room. One last time, I open the door to find no one. I confirm with her that yes, she woke up because of the hey, and I explain to her that I've been dealing with the knocking all night. Roommate doesn't come home until later in the day, and I ask him if he tried to talk to us the previous night. He confirms that he never came home and stayed at a friend's house. I tell him what happened, and he's as stumped as we are. Like I said at the top, we waited the following nights to see if there would be any more weird house sounds, and even as things have warmed up and cooled down again, there have been no more weird noises to suggest pipes or other old house sounds. In general, we're fans of paranormal activity stuff, but I always err on skepticism. This was probably the weirdest thing to happen to us at this house, and I still don't know what it could have been if not some genuine high strangeness. I live in a hamlet. For those who don't know what that is, it's a tiny village, so small. Unless you know someone who lives here, you'd never find it. Where I live has been around before the state I live in was even a state. There are still buildings, though not touched, that stand made of cobblestone. Most people's basements, if they have one, are reinforced cobblestone structures, just like my home. I could tell you countless stories about my home, and I believe I will eventually do so, but this is about my village instead. When I moved here, I came to help my family get things in order with their home, and it didn't take very long to realize how strange this place is. When you enter, you feel like you've entered another place. Driving in, you feel that unearthly feeling of tingles that fade in a second or two. I've lived here for years now, but the feeling never changes, it just becomes part of life. I noticed that after 8 at night, no one was out, save for Friday night. It was so quiet in the village and in the woods that surround it, you wouldn't even hear crickets. Occasionally, if you were lucky, you'd hear the howl of wolves in the distance. They never changed the number of residences because it seemed, as a horror movie as it sounds, every time someone moved in, it was either right after someone died or soon before someone died. I moved here when I was 22, 2 days after a 22-year-old man died outside the village in a motorcycle accident. I could tell you so much about where I live that it would make your skin crawl, so much so that after visiting once, most of my friends never return to where I live, and I have to visit them. Despite all this, I've never felt more comfortable than I do despite all the weird things that happen here. I was always meant to live here, and there's a reason for that. I will get into it another time. As I mentioned, the whole village seems to go to sleep at 8s, except me. I work the late shift, so I get home very late, so maybe that's why I see so many strange things when I take my dog out. Black dogs, people vanishing in thin air, very unusual things. 2 weeks ago, I switched shifts, which meant I was one of those people in before 8 because I had to get up at 5 in the morning. Usually I would drop my dog off at the sitter so I could sleep in instead of taking him out, but unfortunately this day, I had no choice. The sitter was out of town, and I had to get up to take him out. The sun wasn't even up yet, just the misty dew and fog, touched by the light growing in the sky. Light enough to see the details of the street and surrounding area, but dark enough not to say it was truly dawn. I got to the glass door of my apartment, and my dog froze and whined. I was confused and looked outside, making sure there was not a wolf or something outside, but that wasn't the problem. In the street, as if walking, were heavy, dark shadows, like black mist moving separately, walking down the road past my home. I should have felt more unnerved than I did. Instead, I just stared in confusion. Was I seeing this? Did others see this? Is this what kept people inside until sunrise? Questions ran through my head. Rather than thinking about going back up the stairs to my apartment, I instead watched. The shadows seemed to separate in different ways, like a group of friends heading to their respective houses. One floated the speed of someone walking past the street my door faced. It stopped, as if it realized I was watching it. There was no face or features, just a black mist, but I felt like it looked at me, and in an instant, it floated down the road as if running, as if I wasn't supposed to see it, like I had been scared of it while watching it. I waited for a moment before taking my dog outside, a decision that infuriated him greatly, as he had no desire to be outdoors. But I didn't feel uneasy, I wasn't scared, and my dog kept looking in the direction the mist had gone. I wonder what these were. Why did it flee when it noticed me? Do others see them? Do they walk the streets at night and in the morning? Do I want to know? Odd experience on late night walk. I go for a walk late every night around my local neighborhood. I generally stick to the same route, and close to the end of my walk, it takes me through a churchyard. It's a large Victorian church made of smooth red brick. There's a walled, grassy garden surrounding it with trees and a few plaques and benches for people whose cremated remains have been scattered there, but no graveyard as such. Although the general area is fairly residential, the church is immediately surrounded by a large schoolyard, a bowling green, and a park, so it feels very isolated and quiet at night. Because of this, I normally trot through the churchyard at quite a brisk pace. However, some nights when I get there, there's a small black cat waiting for me. When the cat follows me into the churchyard, I don't feel spooked or nervous like I usually would at all. Sometimes I lie on the grass with her in the very early hours, and she gets a stroke while I watch the clouds move over the stars. It's very odd how the whole atmosphere of the place seems to change when that little cat is there. Some nights when I'm out walking, I'll snap a long twig from a hedge along the way and swish at the nettles and what have you. Last night I'd found a beauty, a 4-foot, almost bamboo-like stick from something that had flowered and died back earlier in the season. I'd gone out particularly late, around 3 a.m., and it was getting chilly, so right outside the churchyard, standing around 2 feet from the gate, I stopped for a moment to zip up my hoodie. I popped the stick under my left arm while I did so, like a sergeant major's pace stick, so that around half was sticking out the back. A few seconds later I got a huge shock as my upper body was pushed around by a quarter turn by something applying a sideways force to the section of stick poking out the back. It felt exactly like a person had grasped it in their hand and pushed it to my right. I quickly turned this way and that, but there was no one near me. I was pretty close to panicking, my heart was racing and my breathing was very fast. I tried to calm myself and slow my breathing, and as I did, I noticed a blue glow coming from a parked car around 20 meters away, parked at the side of the road. It was difficult to see anything. The street is illuminated by well-spaced sodium lights, which are partly obscured by foliage at this time of year. I took a few steps closer to the car, straining my eyes in the orange light, and the shape of a man in the driver's seat suddenly became apparent. As I stared, he stepped out of the car and, looking straight at me, took a couple of steps in my direction. He was white, looked around 60 years old, was almost completely bald on top with short gray hair partly over the top and around the sides, and was wearing metal-rimmed glasses, a plain shirt, and dark trousers. I was already really spooked by the stick incident, so I said to myself, "Sod this," turned on my heels, and walked quickly into the churchyard. I heard him say a couple of words I couldn't make out, then the door slammed and the engine started. When I got to the other side of the yard, I could see that he'd driven around the block and was now on the same side as me. I was almost home, but I didn't want him following me there, so I set off in the opposite direction with him slowly coming after me. I was trying to walk nonchalantly, but I was terrified by now. I crossed the park ahead of me, and again he drove around to the side I emerged on. One corner of the park dips and leads to a footpath, which is almost impossible to see from the road as it goes downhill and is surrounded by trees. I've always been a pretty decent runner, but my God, I set a personal best as I switched to a sprint and headed for that corner with him driving down the street towards me. That path is a shortcut into a housing estate, which would take a good 5 minutes to get to by road, so I walked through it in what I hoped was an unpredictable fashion, switching between streets and cutting down alleyways until I was sure I wasn't being followed and then made my way home. I really don't know what to make of any of this. I went out again tonight, and nothing out of the ordinary happened, but I did see my little cat again. Nana's house, late at night. When I was a young boy, I had lots of trouble falling asleep at night. I would lie awake, my mind racing. It would get so bad that I would carry my pillow and blanket around the house and see if I could maybe sleep better in the living room, or sometimes even on my parents' bedroom floor. Looking back, this is pretty embarrassing, but there's a reason I mention it. Every so often, I would stay at my Nana's house with my younger brother. It was a 3-story duplex in one of those 55-plus gated communities that spring up in suburban areas surrounding hospitals. When I was 8, my Nana's second husband passed away from cancer at the hospital right around the corner. Since then, my Nana has always lived alone. Even still, I remember enjoying spending time there, watching lots of VHS-taped shows about alien encounters and ghostly hauntings. That's where I got my thrills. That being said, I've always considered myself skeptical of the paranormal. However, something happened one of those nights at my Nana's house that to this day, over a decade later, I still cannot explain. On this particular night, it was only me sleeping over. The upstairs floor of her 3-story duplex consisted of 2 bedrooms, a large master bedroom, and right across the hallway was another smaller bedroom. Most nights when I stayed over with my younger brother, we would share the large bed in the smaller bedroom, but there was always something a little creepy about that bedroom, and on that night I decided I wouldn't be sleeping alone in that room. Instead, I'll just take a pillow and blanket and sleep on the floor in my Nana's master bedroom. My family was used to my strange sleeping habits, so it was no problem, even though I was probably around 12 years old at this time. I made my bed on the floor, in between the door and the queen-sized bed that furnished the master bedroom, and swiftly fell asleep. I woke up tossing in the middle of the night. It must have been in the very early AM hours. The room was very dark. To my right is the large bed where my Nana lay sleeping. To my left is the bedroom door, left ajar only slightly. I can hear my Nana sleeping in her bed, the soft inhale and exhale of someone in a deep sleep. And then a troubling realization takes hold of me. I notice that hers isn't the only pattern of breathing that I can hear. To my left, in the direction of the hallway, and the room directly across the hall, I can hear a completely separate inhale and exhale. It sounded as though someone was standing right outside the bedroom door. I can remember thinking to myself, am I just imagining this, or am I hearing myself? I remember holding my breath and listening, and then I assured myself that I was hearing two different people breathing. It was easy to tell because the breathing sounds were on opposite sides of me. It continued for at least a full minute, and the more I paid attention to it, the more terrified I became. I pulled my blanket over my head and convinced myself that maybe for some reason, one of my other relatives had shown up and needed to crash in her guest bedroom. Somehow, I eventually fell back to sleep. The next morning, sitting down to pancakes, I asked my Nana if anyone had been over last night. She told me no and asked me why I asked, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I had experienced the night before. That's the one and only time I've ever experienced something that I just cannot explain. Paranormal experience last night. For context, I am visiting my family in Mexico City with my dad and sister. We are staying at my grandparents' house, where my sister and I are staying in one room and my dad in the other. Moving on, after what was a very normal day, I decided to go to bed since it was getting late and I was getting up early the next day. Keep this in mind, the curtains on the window in front of me were closed. It did take me a while to sleep, but that is not out of the ordinary for me. After about an hour, according to my watch on my nightstand, I was woken up by the buzzing of a fly and the itching of bug bites. After about an hour, I decided to go back to bed since I couldn't kill the fly. Thankfully, I was able to go to sleep, but not for long. It was now 1 a.m. I woke up cold and sweaty to the fly buzzing again. The blinds of the window in front of me were now open halfway. I was getting mad at this point, so I turned the lights on to try and kill the fly. I did not see it once. If it wasn't for the bug bites, I would have thought I was hallucinating. After an hour or two, I gave up on killing the fly, so I decided to just chill on my phone for a while and try to go to sleep. This was when I got an overwhelming sense of unease. I realized just how off things were, not a single noise coming from outside, which is usually very busy. Not a single noise was coming from inside, which had a lot of people. I sent a text to my dad to see if maybe he was awake and we could watch TV or something. The text didn't even go through. This was when I got scared. I looked out the half-open window and saw that there was no movement outside at all. Not a single car passing by, nothing. I tried going to bed because I was getting very scared at this point, but I couldn't. No matter how hard I concentrated, I just couldn't go to bed. By now it was 4:30, and I decided that I would just wait until I had to get ready since I couldn't sleep. I could still hear the fly every now and then, but other than that, there were still no noises at all. It must have been around 5 or 6 when I was finally able to sleep. My dad woke me up about an hour later, and I woke up feeling awful and groggy, but the scariest part was seeing that all my bug bites were gone and that the curtains were all closed. I saw a fiery figure appear and disappear in the park late at night. Last night, I was standing in my kitchen, doing the dishes at around 3 a.m., as you do. Our sink is in the extended part of the kitchen, which is basically a utility balcony that we made part of our indoors with double pane glass that slides open on one side. Our apartment is on the first floor. Standing at the sink, one has a clear view of the society's private park, gym building, swimming pool, and a glimpse inside the homes of downstairs residents of different building blocks. Scrubbing away, half asleep, I was letting my eyes flit. I wasn't looking with any purpose or awareness, but after however many rounds of taking in the view, I was hit with a sense of strangeness. So, I focused and looked. It took me a minute to weed out the peculiarity in the picture. In the lawn of a ground floor apartment, there was a sitar-shaped, golden, luminescent figure. It was moving. Barely, but it seemed to be changing positions, which is why I could figure out the shape. It was big enough to be visible clearly against the backdrop of the high-rise. The weirdest thing about it was the visual quality of its luminosity. The lamps in the park had starbursts. Lights from inside the homes were illuminating the balconies, the outer building walls, and some bits of the garden. The light from this figure, however, was touching nothing. It looked matte. A drop of bright golden orange in motion in a pitch-black strip of the lawn. The kids in our housing society had been planning to camp out on the lawn for a while, so I dismissed it as a bonfire. It didn't look like one. There were no flames. I got the sense of a smooth, epoxy surface, with the light coming from some core inside it. I called out to my mom and brother, who were also awake and in the living room. We're a family of insomniacs, so we tend to burn the midnight oil quite often, which is an issue we should get around to addressing soon, but moving on. As I waited for them, I didn't take my eyes off the fiery shape. My mom and brother saw it too. My brother hypothesized that kids were using some sort of mechanical bonfire. My mom thought it was a rakas, a creature from Indian mythology. Made of fire and mostly sighted at night, they are ghosts that are strong enough to develop a corporeal form. Legends say if one of these formidable creatures decides to follow you, they won't be easy to get rid of. The possessed burn with fever until they are too weak to keep the interest of the rakas. If a person has a strong spirit, they may be able to endure carrying it with them, but the strain destroys their vigor over time. Sometime during this mini mythology lesson, the figure disappeared. Meanwhile, someone had washed the dishes. We went back to our dinner. Today, during our evening walk, we explored the area. There is a tree in that exact spot. Since it wasn't the dead of night and we were more inclined to conversation, we discussed it and felt much more disconcerted about the sighting than we had felt the night before. When we'd seen it, we barely gave it any attention and moved on to dinner, ablutions, and bed. Maybe we were in a trance. Maybe we were really tired. Has anyone had similar experiences? What do you think we saw? Reasonable explanations? This happened a couple of years ago. My family and I have lived here for more than 30 years. And since the beginning, there was a dark presence looming over this house, lurking inside and living alongside us. One of the entities had the ability to mimic the appearance of a target. It would take on complete features of the target that it chose and had enough energy to hold that form for us to see it. The form it took on would look completely solid and not gossamer-like a usual apparition. Its favorite target seemed to be my younger sister, who has never seen the entity in her own image. We have all encountered it so far while she prays not to. After a month of silence and tranquility in our house, that particular entity began to act up again. My parents, my cousins, and my aunt had seen it so far. At this point in time, I did not have any encounters with it yet. But I knew something was going to happen. At 8 p.m. one night, my sister came knocking on my door holding a pair of scissors. I looked up from the book I was writing in and asked, "Dude, what's up?" She laughed at my calling her dude and asked me nicely, "Doll, can you cut my hair please?" I inquired as to why she would want me to chop off her locks. Mind you, the length of her hair was now past her knees. She told me she was sick of always braiding it in one super long weird plait. That was all the justification I needed, so I hopped off my bed, and we walked over to the mirror. Within only a few minutes, the deed was done. She only wanted the ends leveled off, and her new length was now 4 inches above her waist. She was excited about her new do and hurried away with the scissors and pieces of hair. I went back to writing and had no thoughts about the matter again. 2 weeks went by, and the house was eerily quiet. Nothing had shown itself to me yet, and I almost forgot what kind of house we were living in. It was about 7 p.m., and I grabbed a huge, fluffy towel and walked down the dimly lit corridor towards the bathroom. It was time for a nice hot bath and some unwinding. At a point in the corridor, you can see straight towards the kitchen. As I walked past, I noticed my sister standing in front of the refrigerator. Her back was turned towards me, and she was facing the refrigerator door that was closed, apparently. I called out to her, "Po. Sup, dude?" She usually always laughs and tells me off in a goofy way, but she did not this time. So I turned around and walked back and tried to get her attention. She never turned around to face me. She just stood there, with her face towards the refrigerator door. I asked again, "Po, you okay?" She never answered me. She never turned around. With a fluffy towel over my right shoulder, I walked a little closer, past the island countertop, so that I could see her better. As I approached her, she still did not move, flinch, or make a sound. She just kept standing there, menacingly. I thought she was just doing this to irk me, to be honest. Standing about a foot away from her back now, I made a disturbing realization. The silent figure of my little sister stood there with one super long weird plait reaching the back of her knees. It felt like my brain stalled on me for a minute. I reasoned with myself, but, didn't I cut her hair? A cold heat ran through my entire body. My breathing sped up, and I stifled all versions of a blood-curdling scream I would have liked to let out. I did not want this thing to turn around, who knows what would have happened. I clutched my towel tightly and made a few steps backward, making sure not to take my eyes off of it. After a couple of minutes of stealth-like backing away, I went outside immediately to find my parents and sister on the front porch. We sat out there for the rest of the night while I told them what I saw. And forgive me, but I skipped a bath that night. I was not going back in that direction for anything. Why am I seeing shadows in my garden at night? Okay, so I live with my grandparents, as they have a small house. I sleep downstairs in the living room, which overlooks the garden through a pair of large sliding doors. I've been a smoker for years now and will often find myself sitting outside late at night having a smoke. The strangeness began almost a month ago. So as I'm sitting watching some videos on my phone while having a late night smoke, I start to get a severe headache. In my head I'm assuming I've just been on my phone too long, and so I decide to switch to a podcast instead. As I listen and finish my smoke, I'm prepared to get up. I see a strange sort of black smoke figure near our conservatory at the end of my garden. I look at it for a while, wondering what it could be. Or maybe my mind is too addled from the lack of sleep, and I've begun hallucinating. Anyway, eventually I convince myself it's nothing and go inside to sleep. Nothing happens until maybe 2 weeks later, when the same thing happens. This time I use the torch on my phone to light up the area. But I can't seem to see anything once I shine my torch on it. So I get up, and I see the same black figure in the gloom. Its head was angled towards me, and to be honest, I was really scared. I felt like maybe everything I believed to be true about the world was wrong. Just to clarify, I'm a really skeptical person by nature, preferring to lead my life on the assumption that the observable cannot influence us even if some strange entities may exist. Indeed, I felt shaken. I eventually gather the courage to run inside. But I've seen it from those big window doors twice since, and it's freaking me out. I feel like it's watching me. For what reason I couldn't tell you. What should I do? I never leave my window open at night anymore. It was March 2017, the start of a new semester at college. After my first went so wrong due to a breakup, depression, and general academic negligence, I was ready for a new start. My roommate and I both had our beds lofted with our desks directly underneath, giving us more space in the dorm room as a whole. While it was still somewhat cold outside, my roommate and I preferred to get fresh air in the dorm when we could. And since we both liked it colder when we slept, we'd crack the window open. This particular night I was feeling a bit more brave and decided to open the window considerably more. That was a regret I would carry with me for the rest of my life. I was disturbed from sleep by light flooding the cracked door as my roommate got up and left to go to the bathroom. I thought nothing of it at the time, as it was almost a nightly routine at this point, and closed my eyes again and tried to fall back asleep. I rolled onto my back to try and get comfier, but something was off. The atmosphere felt different. I mean, yes, the frigid air outside was clashing with the heated air of the dormitory, but that wasn't it. I was used to that. It was something else. Something sinister. Annoyed and figuring I was just being paranoid, I looked around the room. I rolled my head up and glanced into the closet, checked the reflections of the mirrors in the room, and finally I looked down at my feet. That's when I saw the man, or whatever it was. It seemed to have found enjoyment in the fact I discovered its presence because it cackled silently to itself as it moved around the side of my bed. Its features are becoming terrifyingly more apparent as it moved. The few times I have told this story to friends and my therapist, I have avoided using words like inhuman, exaggerated, and disproportionate. To me they were overused, if not cliché, in the creepypastas I read during my middle school cringe era. But now, after seeing this thing, they are the only words I can use to describe it. Its eyes were golden, crimson, wild, and bloodshot. I couldn't tell if they were glowing or just reflecting the little light there was in the room. Comparable to the Sith eyes from the Star Wars movies, if I had to make the comparison. Other features became clearer as it encroached on me like a predator to its prey. Its skin was wrinkled, leathery, and pocked with what looked like age marks. Though it was hard to tell in the dark, it almost looked gray in color. As it moved around to the head of the bed and looked down at me, I saw its crazed eyes were sunken into its skull. Hair that looked dry and coarse came off its balding head as it hovered over me. Its breath was hot and rancid to the point where my nose recoiled in disgust, and I held my own. At last, the creature's mouth revealed itself. It was genuinely inhuman. More like a zipper running from just under ear to ear that was curved upward in a malicious smile. I turned my gaze away, telling myself, no, convincing myself it was only a night terror. That was until I saw him pull out a wicked-looking knife. Jagged and black as obsidian, almost shaped like if a Tibetan spirit knife and a black mistress sword had an evil-bladed child. From that point on, I just closed my eyes and began to pray to whatever deities would hear me despite never having been religious. I felt the blade of the knife touch my throat. I was shivering, whimpering like a puppy in fear, and that seemed to feed this thing all until a warm light filled the room. I instantly spun around in my bed and looked up at my roommate, who had this concerned look on his face. It wasn't until the next morning I found out it was because of the fear in my eye and the tears running down my face. I asked him if he could shut and lock the window while he was up, to which he obliged before crawling back into his bunk and falling back to sleep. I envied him, for I had no such luck. Since then, I have only seen it once, during a visit to my home. I was watching videos on my phone as I tried to fall asleep, and again the atmosphere seemed off. I shut my phone off and just listened. Finally I sat upright, and there, in the closet, was the creature. I had never screamed so loud in my life. I blinked, and it was gone, but I'm not afraid to admit I slept on the floor in my parents' room that night. I have no idea what it was, but in both cases I happened to have the window open or cracked with no screen of any sort. I do believe it had some sort of ill intent with me. A part of me hoped that this would not only allow me to express my story, but also provide some insights into the nature of this entity. I've had one friend say it sounded reminiscent of some European folktale, but I haven't been able to confirm this claim myself with what little research I have done. I just hope I can find answers before it ever decides to come back. Ghost drums in the woods. I was staying the night with my Nana, who lived alone in the middle of the woods except for a few of her animals. My uncle and his hunting buddies were often out hunting deer in season, and one of them told my Nana a convincing and scary story. He told her that when he stopped in the woods to take a break, he heard a rhythmic drumbeat slowly passing him but saw no one. He described it almost like an old small drum and said it could be like a Native American ghost because my Nana lived in an area where she stated had a burial ground nearby. I'm a skeptic, despite having my fair share of stories, and I had no idea if Native Americans had drums, and a war took place in that town, so it could have been soldiers. So I believed it to an extent. But what happened that night after I heard the story still leaves me teary-eyed today. I was up all by myself in the guest room on the other side of my Nana in the trailer, scrolling on my phone. The bed I was on was next to the window. Out of nowhere, I heard drums slowly pass by the window and disappear into the woods. Without a thought, I ran into the bathroom and locked myself in it, trying to think about what it could be. I started thinking about the story I was told. I ran into my Nana's room after 10 minutes and woke her up, telling her what happened. She said it could have been a big buck, stating that their antlers can make a drumming-like noise when walking, but her yard was gated, and beyond it was the woods. It couldn't have been the men either, because hunting season was over, and they all went back home, which was more than an hour away. I still visit to this day and have not heard anything else. However, I continue to hear tales of my family members experiencing unexplainable noises in the woods. Nightly visitor. First off, I want to say that I'm a 29-year-old female who's not afraid of the unknown. I have had so many experiences that I can't even remember them all. The one that stuck with me the most happened years ago when I was 19. I've had other experiences, but this one, like I said, stuck with me. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning when I woke up to use the bathroom. As soon as I turned around to get out of bed, there was a man standing right next to me. At first I thought I was seeing things, so I sat there staring at him. He was a light-skinned African American with a tan hoodie. Now I know I was awake by then because it had been almost a minute. He was solid, not transparent like in some of my other experiences. That's when I freaked out and jumped out of bed, turning on all the lights until I reached the kitchen. I checked both the front door and the back door. They were dead-bolted shut. When I finally got the nerve to check and see what I had actually seen, there was not a single person or a trace of anybody in my house. The scary part was that I was home alone. So I brushed it off as I was seeing things and eventually went back to sleep. The very next night around 3 a.m., I woke again to go to the bathroom. As soon as I opened my eyes, there was the same man standing at the foot of my bed. He looked exactly the same, with the tan hoodie. This time, instead of running, I lay there staring at him for a while until he disappeared in front of my eyes. That's when I knew it was a ghost. That was the last time I saw him. Nightly visitor. I am a 13-year-old female, and this occurred sometime in the fall of last year. We'll call my younger sister, 7 at the time of this occurrence, A, and my brother, 5, B. My grandparents live near the border of Oregon, on the closest side of the state to Idaho. Our grandparents' house had 2 guest rooms, the kids stayed in one and my parents stayed in the other. Grandma's and Grandpa's room was close to ours, their closet sharing a wall with our room. Now that that's cleared up, let's begin. In the fall of last year, my parents had my siblings and me stay 2 nights at my grandparents' house.
The first day we spent there, A, B, Mom, Dad, and I went to watch the first half of a local rodeo.
We had a fun time, and when we got back to the house, it was normal. Nothing happened all night that was worth noting. The next evening, it was only Mom and Dad who went to watch the second half of the rodeo. Mind you, our room had a single queen-sized bed. A slept on the floor, and B slept on one side of the bed, closest to the door, while I slept on the other side of him, closest to the wall. A slept a few feet away from the foot of the bed on a cot. It was maybe 1:23 a.m. I was messing around on my phone, watching some nonsense that I can't even remember today. Everyone was asleep, the parents gone at the rodeo. See, the thing about our bedroom door was that the thing was slightly too big for its frame. Grandpa didn't want to spend the money on replacing it, so they just lived with it. Now don't get me wrong, the door closed, It was just very difficult and loud when trying to open it after. The door was closed all the way. So now picture, if you will, a 12-year-old girl sitting in bed, playing around on her phone. Suddenly, I hear footsteps growing closer to our room. Thinking it's my grandma, I turn off the phone and act sort of sprawled out. You know when you were very small and would pretend to be asleep at daycare so you wouldn't get lectured for playing with your friends? Like, when you closed your eyes 2/3 of the way closed, just barely opened enough that you can see but that your eyelashes cover it from other people seeing. Yeah, well, I did that just to see what grandma was doing. Then the door starts making the scraping sound it made whenever someone tried to open it. Then it's quiet for a minute, and I assumed she had opened it. But then there was this hissing noise. I realized that it was someone running their hand back and forth against the metal headboard of the bed. I realized that there's something moving back and forth in front of the bed, just walking from the left side of the foot of the bed to the right side of it. It's just a shadow of a person. At this point, I'm somewhat panicking for my sister's sake. The thing keeps pacing for a few moments. Then it stops and bends over my brother, still fast asleep beside me. It makes a sound like it's inhaling deeply. Then it straightens and walks calmly out of the room. I hear the door struggle to close and the hissing sound stop. Shaken, yet a bit in disbelief, I ended up going to sleep. The next morning, I came downstairs to see the parents eating breakfast, trying, and failing, to hide their hangovers. We packed things up, loaded it all on the car, said our goodbye to the grandparents, and started home. Once we got home and unpacked, I told Mom and Dad what had happened at dinner. To no one's surprise, they didn't believe me. In fact, my dad looked at me and asked, "Are you sure we shouldn't have you drug tested?" Now jokes aside, I believe I saw something, though I'm not sure what. Perhaps it was a spirit or a shadow person. The realization hit me that it could have been a demon, though the thing didn't give off a menacing presence. It was just there. I'm very aware that this thing couldn't have been either grandparent. They were very old, and they were actually my great-grandparents. My grandma was 81 and grandpa was 83. Therefore, at the pace it was moving, it couldn't have been either one. So who was it? True story from my early 20s, although identities have been concealed. Year, 2002-03. I and my small friend group from high school all went to college in the same state, although at different schools. Throughout our years in university, we'd visit each other at the different schools. One of my friends, Will, went to a small private college affiliated with the Catholic Church with a church, chapel, and graveyard, or cemetery, on and near/around campus. Although Will was born in the US, his entire family was from the islands, Jamaica. He was dating a girl from Trinidad. She had a roommate who was also from the Caribbean, from one of the Francophone islands. One autumn I visited Will for a weekend. That first night we all thought it would be a good idea to have a cemetery party at the cemetery. It was me, Will, his GF, the roommate, Dominique, and a handful of others. I remember it needed to either be less than or more than 13, but it could not be 13. I was a little uncomfortable, but Dominique was downright freaked out by the whole thing. The cemetery is a good 30 minutes trek from the dorms, but given that we had every intention to partake in booze and party favors, I, Will, his GF, and Dominique decided to walk. The others make their way there in 2 vehicles. The cemetery is in the shape of, in the entrance being a long gravel path, at the very end a large statue of a woman, a nun, a female saint, or possibly Mary? In the center. To her right are wrought iron gates that then lead you to a large, sprawling plot of land. On the large plot of land is where the headstones and such are. It wasn't fenced in, but the whole area is completely encircled by a thicket of trees and bush. It's very heavily forested. The guys are acting a fool, but Will is mostly playing it cool. The girls, save Dominique, are acting all spooked out. Dominique is super anxious. I'm being quiet and watchful. I had a small digital camera. One of the guys says to take a picture of the entrance without a flash. I do. He then says to turn the flash on and take a picture. Dominique protests. I hesitate, but I do anyway. Orbs everywhere. Everywhere. Of course, you can't rule out insects. But they definitely look like orbs. Again. Says one of the guys. Dominique pleads not to. I don't. We make our way down the gravel path, and when we get to the iron gate, we just walk right around it. It's not gated. We set up our little party a few feet from the entrance, but a few of us do go into the cemetery to tour the graves. I'm not one of them, and neither is Dominique. So we're just sitting around a battery-powered camp lantern, drinking and smoking some herb. Yes, there were moments of eeriness and times when our hairs would stand on end, but it was mostly anticlimactic. Dominique wasn't having it at all, though. She didn't really drink. Didn't smoke. In fact, she mostly didn't even sit down. She stood as close to the gates as possible. Quiet. I remember looking over at her at one point and feeling so bad for her. Yes, I'd felt some peer pressure to be there too, but what she was feeling seemed to be 10x worse. I then got this feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong, something was off. I just couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the beers? Maybe it was weed? But I told Will, adding that I wanted to get out of there. He'd been playing it cool the entire time and just gave me a nod and said he'd meet me back at the dorm. I took the opportunity to ask Dominique if she wanted to go, and she couldn't have jumped at the chance fast enough. We left. Made it back to the dorms. Everything seemed fine. The weekend finished uneventfully. However, a few weeks later I came to find out that Dominique left school quite abruptly. According to her roommate and friends, she had become convinced that something had attached to her at the cemetery party, and whatever it was, it began haunting and tormenting her. According to Dominique, she was convinced the something was some kind of witch. It was most surprising to her roommate, Will's girlfriend, because she had said it was so uncharacteristic for Dominique, who had excelled in school. At some point after learning all this, I looked at the photo I had taken, the one with the flash. It gave me the complete creeps. I got goosebumps then, and I still get goosebumps now just thinking about it. I wish I still had that picture, but I can still see it in my mind's eye. I used to sneak out of my house as a teenager to go spend time with my girlfriend, who lived 3 miles away. I would normally ride my bike but decided against it that night for some reason. After I leave my girlfriend's house, I head home when I see a pair of headlights coming down the road opposite me. As soon as the car passed me, I could see the surrounding area light up red from their taillights. They were slowing down. The car turned into a side road. I didn't think much of it, probably someone coming home from a bar or something. About a minute passes, and I see headlights coming from behind me. It was the same car. As it got closer to me, it slowed down. I calmly reached for my pocket knife in case anything ducky happened. I wasn't ready for what I was about to see. The car pulls up beside me, I look inside, and it is a man dressed as a clown. He smiled at me, not a friendly smile either. It was a smile that could induce nightmares, a lowered brow and showing his pearly whites. I could feel my legs go numb, and I couldn't look away. After about 15 seconds of driving by me at walking speed, he sped off over the hill. A veil of relief fell over me as I thought I was home free, but nope, there they were, the same distinct headlights roaring over the hill. I knew it was him as I gripped my blade as hard as I could, preparing to defend myself. He slowed down as he approached me. This time his smiling face was gone. He was dead-faced. What I had thought was some cruel joke quickly erupted into the realization that this clown had something sinister planned. He drove past me and turned into a side road once again, and while he was turning around, I knew I had to act fast. I took off running into the woods. Knowing my house was only a mile away, I stayed in the shadows, praying I wouldn't be spotted. Thankfully I got home safely that night. I still wonder what would have happened if I had kept walking the road. A knock in the dead of night. I was a single mother in my mid-40s, and I had just moved to a new house with my then 4-year-old son back when we were living in our hometown of Altoona, Pennsylvania. We had only been there for a few weeks when one late night, there was a knock on our front door. My son was asleep on the couch, and I was still up unpacking and putting things away. I pulled the curtain aside and looked out to see a petite young woman standing and shivering on our porch. I opened the door only as far as the chain latch on the door would allow and asked her what she wanted. She said she had locked herself out of her house and asked if she could come in and use the phone. I asked her where she lived, and she described an address and a house about a block away and around the corner. Something about her story didn't seem right. She would have had to have passed at least half a dozen houses, which I noticed had their porch lights on, and there was also a still operational payphone across the street. I didn't have any change to give her, and alarm bells were still going off about this. With my young son asleep in our living room, I was reluctant to let her in, but it was a chilly winter night, so I offered her a code and my cell phone, which I handed out to her through the doorway. She took the code and my phone, then she called somebody but walked to the other end of the porch where I couldn't hear her, so I closed the door after telling her to put the phone in the mailbox when she was done and to bring my coat back tomorrow. She left the phone but never returned my coat. For several weeks, I got strange phone calls at all hours. People were demanding to know who I was when I answered or simply hanging up. Approximately 2 to 3 months later, on the front page of Altoona's local newspaper was a picture of the young woman who had knocked at our door that night. She and 10 other suspects had been arrested in a major drug bust. I immediately got chills thinking back on that cold winter night, How she showed up in a sleeveless shirt after passing several homes in the neighborhood. I wonder what might have happened to me and my young son if I had ignored my unease and suspicions in spite of her seemingly helpless appearance. I worked the night shift at a hotel. Walking past the pool room, I looked at my watch. It was 1:43 a.m. Out of my peripheral vision, I could see pale eyes hovering just above the water of the deep end. I pretend not to notice, and I keep walking. I have been working at the hotel for years but have only recently begun to see paranormal entities despite feeling the presence I have felt from the beginning. The creature in the pool was new, and by new, I mean I only started seeing it a few days ago. There are several entities I see on my shifts now, but their numbers are increasing. I pretend not to notice them, as I don't want to draw their attention to me. See, the thing is, while I can see them, I have no idea why now or what they want. I figure as long as they think I still don't see them, they will leave me alone. It doesn't bother me that there's cryptids in my hotel, I don't know what they want or how to help. I let out a sigh of exhaustion as I walk into the back office, sitting at the assistant manager's desk, turning on her computer. I start to run my nightly audit as I see the shadow hovering near the laundry room door. I try hard to ignore it as I notice that it's slowly moving closer to me. The shadow was the first cryptid I started seeing. In fact, I believe the shadow followed me here like it's attached to me. I had been seeing the shadow since before I accepted the night audit shift. It usually stayed within sight, but just outside of arm's reach. About 6 months ago I started to see a woman, middle-aged with long dark hair dressed in a hotel robe. It had Marriott monogrammed on the chest. I knew who this was. She had passed away in room 204 on one of my shifts. It was when I saw her after her passing that I realized things around the hotel were changing. She and my shadow were the only ones I had actually seen for the first 3 years, but I could tell by the energy around the building at night that there were more. This moment of clarity chilled me to my core. If I was seeing the woman from 204, it was only a matter of time before the others made themselves known. The entities, or the feeling of their presence, didn't scare me, it was the sudden change. Why now? Why can I see them? What's happening at the hotel to cause such sudden changes in the paranormal? I had considered calling a team of experts, but I wasn't sure if it was me and the fact that I wasn't taking my meds or if there were real entities in the building. As the shadow crept closer to me, I stood and walked to the front desk. As I reached the computer, I noticed the lights in the pool room flicker on and back off a couple of times. The eyes I saw a few minutes ago, whatever they belonged to, were doing this. It's how I first noticed the creature. The first time I saw this, I had walked into the pool room thinking a guest had gotten in somehow and was messing with the lights. I walked in and saw the creature, my heart rate speeding up. I pretended not to notice as I looked around, flicked the switch a few times, mumbling to myself. Must be shitty wiring, I mumbled out loud. When I flicked the switch on, I could see what seemed to be a small child. Its eyes were a pale yellow color, and it had grayish-green scales, not skin. This wasn't the weirdest thing I had seen here lately but definitely the newest. I ignored the yellow-eyed creature. I walked out of the pool room. As I turned the corner, I walked right through the woman from 204. I hated doing this because each time we made contact, I would pass right through her, and it chilled the blood in my body. I could hear the water in the pool ripple, the pace of my walking increasing slightly as I headed to the patio. This was where I got the most peace at the hotel. Aside from the occasional guest, the cryptids seemed to stay inside the building. I settled into one of the chairs near the gas fireplace. I pulled out my phone and opened YouTube. I'm not sure how long I had been sitting there, but I was abruptly interrupted by a guest I had checked in earlier that night. "How are you?" I asked as he lights a cigarette. "Good," he said, taking a big drag. "Just having a hard time sleeping. The guest above me just keeps running the bathtub. I can't figure out why." I froze, lowering my phone but trying to hide my reaction. "Herman," I mumbled. Herman was another guest who had passed away. His passing had happened before I started, but it was big news around the hotel still at the time I was hired. You see, Herman had a heart attack in his bathtub and drowned. He had been in the tub for 4 days before housekeeping found him. Local authorities had tried to locate next of kin for him, but he seemed to not have any, no wife, children, or extended family. We released his body to the city morgue, and he was cremated from my understanding. Since his passing, he periodically ran the bathtub for short periods of time in that room. 4 or 5 times a night usually, and only enough to wake guests around him. It wasn't as scary as it was annoying having to take noise complaint calls about an issue I couldn't fix. By the time I reached the room, the water had already turned off. I'd walk in, stand there for a second, then loud enough for the people in the next room to hear, I'd say, "Mr. Herman, I'm sorry to bother you, But I've had some complaints about the running water. Can we please wait till later in the morning to be running a bath? I'd wait a few seconds and then leave the room. It never really helped, but it usually stopped the calls. As of now, I know of 4 entities in the hotel. Herman, the woman from 204, my shadow, the thing in the pool, and what I referred to as salt, something in the boiler room I never saw but always heard making noise in there as I walked by or went in to grab items from storage. I called it salt because it usually hid behind the water softeners or the large pallet of salt we filled it with. Salt seemed harmless so far, more like a curious child spying on a parent than something that meant harm. Another crypt I ignored, Herman being my only exception. I walked past the boiler room, hearing salt shuffle around as I made my way to the kitchen. It was 3 a.m., and I needed to start setting up breakfast. I'm sure you have several questions, and I'll try to answer them next time, but for now I have to finish breakfast and go scare the thing in the pool off. A cold, creepy night. So I'm a 32-year-old man from the American Midwest. I'm an empath that has always had strange experiences with both things of this world and things more otherworldly. I live in a very ghetto neighborhood that is super dark and creepy at night. For the last year I've seen and felt strange things when I am outside after the sun has gone down, namely shadow people. They tend to lurk at the far end of my backyard near my privacy fence and under these huge old twin shade trees that kind of frame the yard. Once in a while, though, at least one of them seems to get curious and comes close, and that's when shit gets weird. 2 nights ago I was standing out in my driveway with my 2-year-old blue chihuahua named Bella. She refuses to let me go outside without her, leaning against the car smoking a joint when all of a sudden I became very aware of another presence. Not the way you become aware of, say, your neighbor coming outside or something, but aware that something was almost hunting me. Bella suddenly ran under the car and poked her head out, trembling in fear. Something was nearby, and whatever it was terrified my normally fearless little companion. Then I saw the shadow standing near my shed. It was staring at me intently, and I felt my skin crawl as hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I snuffed my joint and just stared back, not wanting to betray my fear lest this thing decide I'm prey. I slowly inched my way to the back door, Bella only coming out from under the car once I had opened it. In the split second I had taken my eyes off it, it had closed the distance and now stood at the back corner only feet away, but it refused to come closer and step into the light, even though by the aura it gave off it wanted nothing more than to pounce. I got inside and shut and locked the door and sprinkled salt across the threshold and lit some sage. The next morning when I opened the door, the screen had these long marks that looked like incredibly long fingers on it. Puzzled, I got a closer look, and they look like something heated the screen to glowing hot because the area the fingers mark has turned that pale gray that screens take on after being heated up and cooling back off. I don't know what the marks are, how they got there, or what left them, but they frighten me. I think I'll be doing a blessing on the property soon, just to be safe. Late at night. My story takes place in Franklin, Ohio. I had just quit my job due to lack of pay and was going to start a new job in a week that paid much more. I and my GF were very excited because not only was I going to get more money, but she also worked at the same job. This particular night she did not have work, though, so we stayed up late watching movies and shows on the internet. It was about 2 a.m. when I realized my GF had fallen asleep. I, of course, have a harder time going to sleep, so I turned off my phone and rolled over, cuddling my GF and shutting my eyes. I lay there for about 10 minutes when I started to feel uneasy. I looked over the room, just barely rolling over. I don't know why, but it felt like something bad was watching me. I immediately thought to myself I was probably just tired or having a small panic attack. I have them at random times, and anyone with anxiety can tell you the feeling is like you're scared or unsure of things. So thinking it was just a mini freakout, I rolled back over to hold my GF again and try to sleep. I closed my eyes and began to drift off to sleep. Until I heard what sounded like something brushing against the top of my doorframe, as if someone was standing there with a bristle brush and was rubbing it slightly against the top of the doorframe. Now to give you a rundown of my room, my bed is long ways to my wall and right beside my door. So I looked down at my phone to see the time, and it was about 2:48 a.m. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing and closed my eyes again. When I was closing my eyes, I could swear something was right over me, looking down at me intently. I could literally feel myself starting to sweat as pictures of whatever it was swept through my brain. I slowly opened my eyes just enough to look down towards the door. At first I saw nothing but the dark hallway. Then as my eyes adjusted, I began making out a figure so terrifying I almost stopped breathing. It was all black with what looked like hair all over. It had a long, thin neck, and the longer hair on it was on the back of the neck, kind of like how a horse's mane goes down its neck. The head was the same size as the neck, just bent over as if a finger with the tip of the finger bent down and hair like bangs covering the face. I could not see the body, but I knew it must have been big to have such a big neck and head. I stared at it in disbelief, scared, shocked, and wondering if I'd lost my mind. Its neck stretched out, the hair dangling down from its neck, and it turned my way. I stopped breathing immediately. I could barely see this thing's eyes, but from what I could see, they were white with a black ring on the outside. Its neck continued to stretch out, moving up towards my face. I closed my eyes tightly and started to pray to God. I then peeked through my eyelids and saw nothing. I opened my eyes fully, and it was gone. I jumped up and turned the light on fast, but nothing was there. I ran to my son's room to check on him, but he was sleeping soundly. Feeling scared and tired, I grabbed my son and laid him in bed with me and my GF. A few days later, I moved our bed to the other side of the room. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I thank God that he helped me that night. I don't know what it was, I just hope that I will never see it again. The unheard screams of the night. The story in and of itself might not be very scary for some, but what made it unsettling for me is the context around it, so I will start with that. It was a few years back, I was 21 at the time. The story happened in France. I lived in a gendarmery with my mother and father during my master's degree study, and no one else. We didn't have any pets either. A gendarmerie is a sort of police station but for military police and generally serves the same purpose but for smaller towns and cities. Since my father used to work there, we had a service flat given to my father so we could live with him at work. I've lived there for 11 years at that point. It's a nice, quiet little city, and there is some wildlife on the edges of the city, but nothing too crazy, maybe some wild boars, a few snakes, and foxes, but that's about it. However, in the center of the city where I'd live, there would never be anything like that. The apartment I lived in was on the 6th floor, the door that led to it was very bulky, and if you let go of the door, it would lock you out automatically. All the windows in the house had double glazing for noise isolation since we lived right next to the highway, so if you'd close the windows, you wouldn't hear anything except for muffled truck horns at times. Now for the story itself, I cannot remember the exact month since I shrugged off the story later on. All I can tell is that it was not summertime as we'd let the windows open at night in the summer to cool down the apartment. We did not have AC at the time. I would wake up very late at night, or early in the morning depending on how you'd look at it, at around 2 a.m. by a loud banging on my bedroom door. I always keep it locked at night because I like my privacy, and my mother has an unhealthy habit of snooping around. I obviously got startled and woke up on the nerves because while it happened that my father or mother would wake me up at night for urgent matters, they would usually knock as well as call out my name and not bang. However, this definitely sounded more like banging, and there was no voice calling out to me. I would make for an uninteresting horror protagonist since I figured that, whatever is out there, I'm safer in my locked room than going out. I was scared that whatever was out would hurt my parents and thought to myself that if I heard my parents be in distress, I'd take up my courage and help them. The banging stopped eventually as I listened carefully, and there was nothing. I could even hear my mother snoring in her bedroom, so I figured that it was safe to check after 5 to 10 minutes. I take a TV remote and my cell phone with me just to make myself feel more armed, and with the flashlight on my phone, I investigate every room. There seems to be no sign of intrusion, stolen goods, or broken stuff anywhere, and since both of my parents were still asleep, I figured that it might have been a strong gust of wind hitting my door, or at least that's what I rolled with because I needed to reassure myself. It still felt odd that none of my parents woke up from how loud it was. Although our windows were closed at the time, so it's more denial than it is an explanation. I went back to bed, locking my door once more and snoozing once my nerves calmed down. I woke up not an hour later to the sounds of screaming. It sounded like a woman was being murdered. I was terrified, shivering in my bed, covers held tight against me. It was loud yet so distant, you could hear it echo, so it was outside for sure, but it meant that whatever was screaming was louder than a truck horn. It sounded mostly like a woman, but it was very intimidating, not like someone screaming for help but rather out of anger. It also had that uncanny valley of it sounds human, but it's not human, and it also had a sort of breathiness to it, like it was panting between the screams. It kept on going for a solid 10 minutes as I cowered in my bed, my mind making thoughts much darker than what was probably the truth. I stayed up for probably half an hour, my heart beating in my chest as I slowly relaxed to the return of the silence. At that point, I was so exhausted I ended up passing out. I woke up the next morning at 10, which is not unusual for me, and the first thing I did was ask my parents. At first I asked them if they heard any cat fighting last night, thinking that maybe I got the spooks from something that mundane. They told me they did not and asked me why. I explained to them the whole thing and emphasized that it was almost like a woman screaming for help, and I was shocked that none of them heard that with how impossibly loud it was. They kept dismissing it, and it was as if it was weird of me to keep asking to make sure they didn't hear anything that was remotely close to what I could have heard. Nothing happened. We continued with our daily activities. I remained perplexed, but attempted to consider the possibility that it might have been an animal. However, I firmly believe that no creature in our small urban city could have produced such a noise at night. The fact that no one else seemed to have heard it unnerved me, as I was certain that I had not imagined such a thing. For my door, I could only blame wind, even though I don't know how wind could have entered my apartment that night. For the screaming, maybe it was a lynx? We have those in France, even if they are rare and even rarer where I used to live. However, those two rational explanations don't entirely align with my emotions, and I suppose I'll never fully understand what transpired that night. Alone in a forest camping. I quite often camp alone in forests and have never been scared of it, but last time I was there it was kind of really weird. Previous visits in that forest, there were other campers, but this time I went Monday evening, so no one else was there. As soon as the sun set, around 1 a.m., and it became pitch black, I heard some branches cracking, but I ignored them. An hour later, I heard footsteps, so I looked around with a flashlight, but saw no one. I returned to my campfire, ignored the sounds again, and turned up the music to drown out the forest noises. But sounds kept happening around 3 a.m. It got kind of weirder because I could hear branches cracking like someone was walking there, not like an animal would move, or if it's an animal, I would see it. On the right side, then I'd turn there, and then they come to the left of me. I look there, nothing, and again from that position, the next sound is to the left again. That's when it kind of got a little bit spooky because I was hoping to just find another human/traveler making those noises, but there was nobody even close to me. Well, as a Finnish person, I kind of told him in my language, Perkele, Joset tuota aksien noxotelua lapita, niin napa sayua niskasta kini. Which is kind of funny when I think it's translated to devil, if you won't stop that branch from cracking, I'm going to grab you from the nape. But Perkele is a commonly used curse word anyway in here. After that, sounds calmed down in some way, some minor sounds that could be normal mice, etc. After that, my mind could at least explain as animals. But I still stayed up until the sun rose up again, and it was total silence, actually, with sunshine because sounds never fully stop during dark times. But yeah, I don't get scared easily. I go on graveyards alone at 6 a.m. just to hear the same type of footsteps from past lives, and I think I get along with them somewhat. But again, I have been camping every year, and I do camping a lot, and this is literally the first time I heard noises that didn't come from animals either. I've been camping in that exact spot before, and that night there weren't any noises, and that time there were even a few people camping, like 100 meters away from me. So I know the differences between what normal human sounds and what animal sounds in the forest, etc. But those sounds I heard I can't explain. If it had been a fox, bear, lynx, or wolf, I would have seen it. And smaller animals don't crack branches while they walk around. Late night visitor. I have lived in the middle of the forest in southern British Columbia, Canada, for my whole life, and only recently have I noticed some strange things occurring. I am wondering if it is due to all the forest fires we have had in the last few years. Lots of wildlife have been forced to move from their homes. This has caused a lot of wildlife to disrupt the usual flow of things as they try to find food and new places to live. Though, this is only one explanation I have come up with. Closer to the end of the year, my German Shepherd, Kata, has been barking a lot around the house, more and more often. Usually I chalk it up to her being bored, but I can tell by the different barks she makes if something is actually there. Also, it is not uncommon for her to dash into the brush after some unknown animal, usually a deer, with her little mutt sidekick, Jazzy. They can be gone for hours at a time. So anyway, I wake up one October night to hear the strangest sound coming from outside my window. I live on the second floor of my house, with the deck right below me. The sound was so close that at first I was scared something was in my room. As I got out of my bed, I realized whatever it was had to be directly below me outside. It had to have been right up against our house, which was pretty ballsy for any wild animal, considering the smell of our dogs and us humans should be everywhere. It sounded like a sort of howl, though it was no howl either of my dogs have ever made or are able to make, trust me, I know. It was very low and almost sounded sad, but a bit like a rumbling growl. As if whatever it was lazily but persistently just breathing out the sound. No way was this my dog, and it sounded unlike any coyote or wolf I have ever heard. Because I have lived out here so long and often enjoy camping in the woods, I have heard countless wolf and coyote sounds. I am usually able to differentiate. Also, it is extremely unlikely that it is a neighbor's dog, for no neighbor's dogs dare come near our house because our old wolf dog would fight them off. Also, the neighbors' homes are very far apart. Then, the thought occurred to me that my dogs were not barking. They should be going crazy right now, considering there was something so close. The only conclusion was that it must be Kata, since sometimes she will bark when she wants inside, but something had to be very wrong with her. I go downstairs and open my front door and call out for her to come inside. The sound has stopped, and in its place I can hear claws on the deck booking it in the other direction. It is too dark for me to see anything, and my window was on the other side of the house. Then I really get scared. I hear my dog barking in the trees, in a completely different direction. She must have been off on a deer-infested adventure while this happened. So, what was howling under my window? My sister came downstairs to ask me what I was doing. When I told her about the sound, she said she had heard it too. But only a little bit as she was waking up, and she would not have remembered it had I not reminded her. What's even scarier is the fact that our front door was broken at the time, so whatever it was could have simply pushed its way in. Let me know what you guys think. I'm grateful for any insight you may have. I have never seen a ghost, still haven't, but this is probably the closest I think I have ever been to a true paranormal experience. This occurred in Tennessee in the summer of 2006. My wife was working nights at a hospital, and we were living in a remodeled house on a small farm. We did no farming at all, minus some peach trees in the backyard, but had a small pond and leased the acreage for cattle. Not really important, but I'm trying to convey that this is an actual event and not something made up. I was sitting in our office on the computer one night, uploading resumes and probably looking at naughty websites. I honestly don't recall. It was a typical night by most standards. Around midnight, best I can remember, I got this distinct feeling that someone had walked into the room, and then I felt a warm hand gently rest itself on the back of my neck. It didn't even register initially that it was out of place, until I remembered that my wife was at work 35 miles away and I would have seen her walk in. We lived alone, no kids yet either. I kind of froze, halfway expecting I was about to be robbed. I slowly turned my chair around to an empty room. My hair was standing on end. And then, my guitar, which was in its case, strummed itself twice. Loudly. I never really understood the term frozen with fear until that moment. I did the only sensible thing. I ran into my backyard and spent a surprisingly restful night in a hammock. Years later, when I tell that story to friends who knew me then, several of them have independently relayed to me that they always had an uneasy feeling while in the house but didn't want to scare us. We lived there for 4 years, nothing else ever happened except a picture falling off the wall one night around 2 a.m., but the wire had broken on it. That's my story. It's 100% true and unembellished. I have a puppy who still has accidents at night if she doesn't get taken out fairly late, so we usually go for a walk between 1 and 2 a.m. My neighborhood is pretty calm, but sometimes weird shit happens. I swear I've heard gunshots before. We live across from some low-income/government assisted housing, and while our town is fairly nice, there's usually about one incident in that neighborhood a month. I once heard someone using what sounded like an industrial vacuum cleaner, which normally wouldn't be creepy, but for some reason it is at 2 a.m. Probably the creepiest of all, though, is that there's one area in the neighborhood that is not well lit. The only light comes from one lonely porch light, and it doesn't light up very much of the area at all, so it's basically pitch black. My dog tends to stop right there and growl and refuse to move, because she's kind of an asshole. The worst night, I kept hearing noises, kind of a twinkling noise, almost, is the best way to describe it, and realized as we approached that part of the neighborhood that it was coming from that dark patch. She stopped and growled, but it quickly turned to a whine. I picked her up, sprinted back to our apartment, and made my dad finish her walk. Always believed my old childhood home was haunted, as I, my mom, my dad, my sister, and my aunt all had experiences there. Those are just the ones I explicitly know of. There are likely more people who've experienced things. My grandfather worked his ass off to build the home and get everything set up, and we were inclined to believe he kept watch over us regularly after his tragically early passing. None of his grandchildren ever got the chance to meet him. However, according to my mom, I had seen him sitting on his old wooden stereo that spanned the length of our dining room wall when I was a toddler. I don't remember that experience because of how young I was. I asked her, "Who is that man here?" And she responded with, "What man?" And I walked over to him, acted as if I was patting his leg, and said, "It's okay, I see you." If I recall correctly, I think I even pointed him out in a picture as the person I saw. There were several other, mostly, minor instances that weren't too difficult to rationalize that occurred to all of us, but I'll share the spookiest thing that happened to me during my middle school years. One night I kept hearing creaks, cracks, and knocks near my bedroom door and in the hallway just beyond it. My bed was positioned where I couldn't see directly into the hallway, and my door had to remain open to supply heat to the rest of the house as the vent in my room worked better than any of the others. These noises occasionally happen for small stretches some nights, and I don't know exactly how to describe their frequency, but I will say that they always seemed deliberate and relatively intelligent. Like whatever was making the noises was acutely aware of if I was paying attention to it or not. The noises would usually die down when I actively listened to or looked for them. And if I outright ignored them, they'd usually stop after a bit, or I'd just fall asleep in spite of them, which was admittedly rare because this spooked me a lot as a kid. This particular night, however, they were a bit more aggressive. Almost like there was a certain excitement to them. They continued for a few hours in the middle of the night while everyone else was asleep. I'd say roughly from 10 or 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. is when this took place. I could not sleep at all, and every time I started to drift off, the noises became much heavier, so I figured I'd read a book to make me as sleepy as possible. I grabbed a Bible and read the most boring passages I could find. I was to the point where I was drifting off with the overhead light on and me on my side with my head propped up in my hand. And every single time I began to doze, I'd be woken up by these noises. I'd finally had enough and decided I'd sleep in my mom's room if she'd let me. It always felt like her room was afforded a certain sense of privacy, further lending to our theory of it being my grandfather. This is where things went from I can maybe rationalize this to this is freaking insane. I closed the book, set it on my nightstand, got up, and began walking to the door when I started hearing crinkling behind me. We kids had ruined a mattress or two in the past by spilling stuff on them, so the plastic wrapping was left on our current ones for easier cleanup and to avoid having to buy new ones in such cases. Now sometimes there would absolutely be a little crinkling heard after getting up off of it, but this time it was quite a bit louder and lasted longer. I got to my door, realized it was still crinkling, and my curiosity got the better of me. I turned around, and I could see the material moving on the side of the mattress. There was an impression in it moving from the lower end up towards the headboard, like someone was brushing up against it walking by. I immediately noped the hell out of there, and as I was speed walking, I didn't run because I didn't want to wake everyone else up. Down the hallway, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I got to my mom's room at the other end of the house, woke her up, and asked, "Can I sleep in here tonight?" She asked, "Why? What's wrong?"
And I stammered, saying, I don't know.
"There's something out there," she said. "Well, do you have your pillow? You're not taking mine." I didn't, so I went back to get one of mine. When I approached the hallway, the footsteps started up again, directly behind me this time. Again, curiosity got to me. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal, but part of me was also hoping with every fiber of my being that I could find a rational explanation. I stopped halfway down the hallway and listened, thinking maybe it's just the echo of my own footsteps or something, even though I'd never once heard an echo in that house. As soon as I stopped, I heard another 2 steps behind me that sounded like they were getting closer to me. I stayed still for a split second, but when I realized that the second step I heard after I stopped was maybe a foot away from me and the first one was farther away, meaning I was being followed, I stopped worrying about not waking anyone else up. I sprinted to my bed, snatched a pillow up, and sprinted back to my mom's room, hearing extra footsteps in the hallway, no longer following me, up until I got close to her door. I fell asleep probably close to a half an hour later, and the next day I tried to just let it go. Not necessarily forget about it, but just let it not get to me. After all, I never explicitly felt threatened by a presence in the house. Been spooked a few times, but that was the closest it ever felt like it was specifically messing with me. I didn't realize until after getting back home from school the next afternoon and hearing my mom on the phone that it was my grandma's birthday, something that I learned years later as an adult, and living in a different house, was that my grandfather always loved celebrating and making a big deal of my grandma's birthday. Maybe he was just celebrating that particular night or, in his own way, preparing for her birthday the next day, but certain things began to make a lot of sense in hindsight, at least as much as they can for something paranormal, as around that time of year I would tend to have more of my unexplained experiences. Anyways, thanks to anyone who took the time to listen to this. This story happened back when I was in high school. I and 2 friends, we'll call them Jay and Ray, had been talking about taking a camping trip to popular swimming in Oregon. We agreed to a spot that we would go to and smoke weed. I and Jay asked Ray not to bring his girlfriend Sabrina, since she was a straight-up city girl. We planned to go the weekend after Halloween. I stayed at Jay's so we could just get up and pick up Ray. Myself, and Jay packed up his car and headed over to Ray's. When we got there, Sabrina had camping gear with her as well. Jay asked Ray what was going on, and Ray told us that she would be a buzzkill. Jay and I couldn't stand Sabrina, so we said we forgot something and went back to Jay's. We grabbed the werewolf costume I used on Halloween night. After everything got packed at Ray's, we left the city and went to the site. We arrived at our spot after a 45-minute drive and a 4-hour hike into the woods, but by the time we finished setting up the tents and started a fire, it was already dark. Sabrina did nothing but complain. Jay and I said we were going to bed. It's been a long day, so did Ray and Sabrina. Jay helped me get the werewolf outfit. I went over to Ray's tent and scratched at it, crouched down in front of the tent door, and looked at Sabrina. She screamed, and then Ray pulled a 9mm and pointed it at my face. I pulled off the mask and shouted, "It's just me, man." Ray told it wasn't funny. We went to bed. At about maybe 2:30 to 3:30 a.m., Jay and I heard heavy footsteps walking around outside and the tent getting pushed in. We thought it was Ray messing with us. That morning when Jay and I stepped outside, there were human-canine hybrid bipedal footprints around our and Ray's tent. We called him out on it, but Ray denied that it was them because he heard it and believed it was us messing with them. We followed them to the edge of the tree line and saw massive claw marks in a tree. We packed up and have not gone back since. All of us still talk from time to time, but we don't bring that night up. Thanks for listening. My mom's ghostly twin. At this time, we lived in a small 2 to 3 bedroom house. It was an upstairs-downstairs home and consisted of me, my mom, my little brother, and my sister. Now my sister and I shared a bedroom, and my little brother had his own. But my mom had her bedroom downstairs, so she didn't sleep on the same floor as us. Around this time I remember being in my late elementary ages, 7 to 8 years old, and my siblings were a year or two younger than me. 6 to 7 years old, so you can imagine we'd get easily frightened by the dark and our imagination around bedtime. It's expected to have these irrational fears at this age, but it also didn't help that our house was a little off at night. My mom would joke that it were her ghost boyfriend Jerry, but I think deep down she'd say it because she was also scared, and she didn't want to give us further reason to be scared. Our house was especially weird at night. Things would make noise on their own accord, such as heavy footsteps that belonged to no one who was creeping around the house at night, making the floorboards creak. Even stomping in certain rooms of the house on some nights, demanding to be acknowledged. Voices echoed in the halls that were also not ours. They were very clear but also vague, silent cries, and, more simply, weeps or calls to someone, anyone listening to them. Things would disappear and reappear in the home. It was all weird, and I swear whatever else lived there had a thing for tormenting me and my siblings. I never really acknowledged it when we lived there, but when I revisit these memories, I get unsettled, as it definitely wasn't normal. Although this night it seemed it was a regular night for me at bedtime, I had been lying in my brother's room with him and my sister as one had mentioned they were feeling uneasy, so I and my sister decided to sleep over in my brother's room. This just helped us go to bed easier. It especially helped that his bedroom window invited the light from the street into his room, making it slightly easier to see in the dark, rather than my and my sister's room, which would be darker at this time. It didn't help that we also had a large closet in there too. I lay down the furthest and closest to the edge of the bed, waking from the bed rocking a little when I slept. My brother's bed was at a loft bunk. It was high enough but also had enough space underneath that you could sit up under it. The only thing is that underneath it lay piles of dirty clothes, so there was no space to crawl or move under there freely. My eyes wandered around the room, and with me being half asleep, I followed the lights reflecting on the wall into the hallway of my brother's doorway. That's when I saw it. The figure, the shadowy figure, the silhouetted mimic of my mom. As you'd expect, younger me's breath stiffened, and my eyes widened. My attention heightened by this potential threat while I had a mini heart attack in the loud silence. Almost instinctively, I shook my brother. He was closest to me, and I didn't want to take my eyes off of whatever it was I was looking at so I could tell if I were seeing this for real. I shook and shook and shook, refusing to let him fall back to sleep after the first few shakes. When I heard him wake, I felt immediate relief. Something about him being awake told me I wasn't dreaming now and was no longer alone to experience this. A reason to be brave. I cleared my throat and managed to ask him when he sat up, "Do you see that at all?" I pointed it out to him and described it as he tried to find what I was looking at. It was so dark it was hard to tell if I was just imagining it or if it was real. The best way to describe it is that it was a shadowy figure, a literal silhouette. It had no face, no clothes, but a shadowy aura that made it hard to see its skin or body clearly. The only thing that seemed really visible was its hair, which copied our mother's. It was so curly, the same length, and practically laid in the same style my mom's hair would lay in. It continued to stare at us silently, still, uncannily, and feeding on our fears. It was extremely unnerving the way it sat just in the hall, hiding right before the doorway, peeking into the room at us. It blended into the dark. The only way for us to tell it was really there was by the strands of its hair that stayed visibly clear to see. It listened to our irrational conversation and weak attempts to scare it off, staying still and silent. My brother, now seeing it, had gotten the same idea I had and began calling out to it, believing it were our mother. "Mommy, we see you. We know that's you, Mommy." Now that I think of it, it really frightens me that we even thought it was our mom to begin with. That's how similar it was to her, and with so few features to work with, we were convinced out of fear. The fact that it knew it looked like her too and mimicked her is what scares me most. My reasoning for believing this was my mom was maybe she wanted us to go to bed, so she scared us to do so, but it also didn't dawn on me that I had woken up to that originally. In the process of me and my brother trying to convince ourselves it was her, we lay down to show her we were going to bed, in hopes she'd walk away, move, or say something to prove it was her. Especially if we're assuming she were doing that one distinct mom glare that moms do to get their kids to behave. Looking away for a slight second, the figure finally moved. It was abrupt and quick. It ran at us and hid right underneath the bed. I and my brother looked at each other, fully convinced this was our mom now, believing she was playing an odd game with us. We peeked under the bed after sitting up from the jumpstart and didn't see anything but the laundry left there before. It looked untouched and also still. We didn't see our mom but the cloth piles instead. This made my heart sink immediately, as my mind went to whatever it was is now gone, but it's also right under us. I know my brother was scared too, as he began hiding under his blanket and scooting away from the edge of the bed. I did the same, ensuring that my siblings were safe as my sister slept through all of this beside us. To this day I have no idea what I experienced, but this ghost or entity has taken up some space in my brain since. I don't know how we slept after that, but we did. It was so scary we never spoke of it till a few years later, and when we brought it up to our mom after moving out of the house, she had a nervous laugh about it, as she had never heard of this happening but also confirmed she'd never done something like that to us. It was a weird home after all, and I have a few more stories of weird encounters that happened there, but they were all slightly less traumatizing. Let me know if you experienced anything similar or if we can name this phenomenon. Watcher at night. As I was a kid, it happened occasionally that during the night, when I was lying in my bed in my room, I could feel a very intense presence watching me. It was a rather rare event, maybe a few times in a year, and when I could feel it, usually when I woke up randomly at night from it, I just kept my eyes closed and tried to ignore it until it either vanished or I fell back asleep. It did not feel like anything benevolent. Definitely more on the evil side of things. Well, as I got older, I felt that my behavior was kind of silly. Hence, I decided that I should confront this weird fear. As I got the feeling the next time, I confronted the presence by just opening my eyes and saying loudly a friendly hello. Big mistake. The presence got by orders of magnitude more intense than it had ever been before. And my memories of the event start to get messy from there on. Because I know that at the start of it I was absolutely, 100% awake. I know this because I did my lucid dreaming check, looking at the alarm clock twice and confirming that the time it shows does stay consistent and does not randomly change. When you are dreaming, written text and numbers always change when you look away briefly. I also know that in the end I was definitely, 100% asleep. I was in a bright room with a relative, a cousin, of mine sitting on the bed and berating me to never again do something so stupid as speaking to it. I later wrote her on WhatsApp just to check if she maybe also met me in her dream or something like this, but no. However, I have no idea when, in between these two events, I fell asleep. I think I remember that immediately after doing the alarm clock check, I stood up to just leave my room, pretty much in a panic. As I tried this, dozens of shadow hands broke through the floor and tried to catch me. I think successfully, but I really cannot remember this part. Logically, I must have fallen asleep between my lucid dreaming check and this, but there was no time in between. This is about all that I remember. I have written down some of this experience but will have to look for my notes. I also doubt that they contain much more specific information than what I wrote here. Anyways, after this last, extreme experience, I never talked to the watcher again. I also did not experience it again for several years now, since I am not anymore living with my parents, and it only ever happened in that old room of mine. Knock in the night. It is incredibly hot where I live during the summer. No one leaves the air-conditioned paradise that is their home unless they absolutely have to. Watching the news one night, the weatherman, speaking in his usual drone, informed us that there was a heat wave incoming and that it would be even hotter than it normally is over the weekend. Oh hell no, my husband says to me, clearly irritated. Well, why don't we go to my grandpa's cabin Friday night to avoid it? I replied. He definitely liked the idea. My grandfather gave us his permission to go up there for the weekend, just asking that we do a few things to help him keep it cleaned up and do some fire hazard reduction for him. We agreed, looking forward to a weekend alone and out of the heat. Thursday evening we pick up the keys from him and pack up our truck to leave early in the morning. Friday morning we're headed up there and stopping in a small town at the base of the mountain to get some gas and snacks. We're standing outside the truck, eating push pops, waiting for the gas to pump when my husband smiles at me wryly. "Don't you dare," I say, knowing full well what is about to come out of his mouth. He starts chuckling between licks of his push pop and whispers in my ear, "Slenderman. Ha ha ha. Slendy is waiting for you up there. You're hilarious," I reply sarcastically. "If only." We reach the cabin and get the lights and water going. Take our bags and the groceries in. It's a little chilly, so I decide to grab some firewood from the back while he finishes unloading the truck. I stop abruptly at the side of the house, as I notice some scratch marks. Long, thin, and going along the side like someone was dragging a rake almost while walking along. Those weren't there last time I was here, but it had been a very long time since I had been there, so I shook my head and continued on to the back to grab a few logs. The rest of the day goes by without incident. We go fishing, ride the ATVs, and make some s'mores. We're sitting comfortably, cuddling on the sofa, flipping through channels on whatever the rabbit ears on the TV will pick up when we hear scratching and knocking along the side of the house. My husband must have felt me tense up because he immediately said, "It's probably rats." I look at him and say, "Are you ducking kidding me? Rats? No way." The sound suddenly stops and doesn't start up again, so after an hour or so we go to bed. The next morning I go outside to grab more firewood. Curiosity gets the better of me, and I decide to go look on the side of the cabin where I heard the banging, and what I see immediately makes me want to puke. Sure, the sound was rats being nailed to the wall. There are half-eaten rat carcasses all over the wall, surrounded by those same scratch marks that I had seen the day before. That was enough for me. I start yelling for my husband to show him. "Whoa, that's messed up," he says when I show him. "I want to leave. Like, today. I don't want to stay another night." He makes another joke about Slenderman and tells me we'll be fine. "If it makes you feel safer, we'll shut all the window and door coverings." The cabin had these big wooden doors and window coverings that lock to prevent anyone from breaking in while no one is there. I agree to this and say we'll stay another night. Just before dusk, we lock everything up and barricade the front door, mostly because I demanded it so I could sleep easily. Just as the night before, as we're sitting down watching television, I hear the dragging, scratching, and knocking. I sit there petrified. My husband yells, "Stop it. Whoever you aren't funny." Just as he says that, the knocking intensifies, and we hear a deep growling through the cracks in the wood. Puffs of breath say in a crackling inhuman voice, "Come out to play with me." I run up the stairs faster than I have ever run in my entire life, heart thundering hard against my chest, barely able to breathe. I hide under the covers. What the heck that's going to do, I don't know, but it brings me an inkling of comfort. I sit there cursing my husband for not leaving when we had the chance. Whatever is out there laughs in that horrible voice for hours. Knocking and knocking all over the house, claws scratching the walls. Rattling the doors and window coverings, trying so hard to get them open. Eventually it stops, and we fall into an uneasy sleep. That morning we pack up our shit in a hurry and get into the truck. The house is covered in torn in half animals. Raccoons, squirrels, foxes, and there's even half a deer on the deck. We throw all of our shit into the truck, and just before we leave, I remember that my grandpa keeps motion capture cameras on the trees surrounding the house because he likes the pictures of the wildlife. I grab them and flip through them as we're driving off, happy to be getting the heck out of there. The pictures are nice enough. Some deer, a few blue jays, which makes me smile because they're his favorite. Just as I finally start to relax and breathe easy, I start to see pictures of the animals being nailed to the cabin. The next picture has me shaking so hard I'm about to drop the camera. Written in blood on the side of the cabin where I had originally seen the scratches are the words, "Goodbye. Thanks for playing." The final picture is what makes me scream. The first thing I notice is the yellow cat's slit eyes, glaring into the camera. The minuscule, pinprick teeth covered in fur and blood and all manner of viscera. It's hunched over, its spine in an arch, waving at the camera. Furry stick-like legs ending in cloven hooves with the torso of a man. It's emaciated and gangly thin. It's clearly laughing at us and the fun it's having. I drop the camera, willing the image out of my mind, and look out the window, just in time to see it waving at me as we drive out of the woods. These are some of my true paranormal activity stories. The first experiences I can remember were inside my great-grandparents' house. After my great-grandfather passed away, I would stay with my great-grandmother often. She lived completely alone. We would hear knocks on the doors and walls late at night. Footsteps and whispering. Pots and pans clanging. I was only 4 or 5 at this point. She assured me that it was just my grandpa and to not be scared. She would even sometimes talk to him in a jestful manner. I didn't fully understand because I was so young. She passed away a year or so later. We moved into the house after that. I was around 8 years old and in the 3rd grade. The house was built in the 1930s and was only 2 bedrooms originally. I had one room to myself. My little brother and sister, who are twins, had the other room. They were barely a year old, still in their cribs. My mom and her 3rd husband slept on a hideaway bed that folded out from the couch. My bedroom faced the living room where they slept. My door faced out where the couch was, so I could see them sleeping while lying in my bed at night. I had a large chiffon closet in my room and a metal frame bed. The first week we moved in, I began to experience things. I would be awoken by noise and see a shadow moving around in the living room. I would get scared and cover my head up and try to go back to sleep. I would hear something in the chiffon closet regularly. One night I was awoken by bright lights. Lights so bright my first thought was someone was parked in a car in front of my window, but that's impossible. One night I saw a figure, best described as the opposite of a shadow person, like it was bathed in light, standing over my mother. Some nights I would hear scratching or tapping on my window. One night my metal bed frame started shaking ever so slowly, then a little bit faster, and more erratically, like some faint type of force was just shaking it randomly. Shortly after that, I had my first experience with sleep paralysis. I told my mother about it the next day, and she admitted to having the same experience. She described it as a shadow man with a hood over his head, holding her down and sucking the energy out of her. We even made up a name for him, Hoodie. This was in 1997, and we didn't have the internet, so we had no idea this kind of thing was common. There is something that I'm not particularly fond of, however, and it's that I have a real-life experience that may leave your other listeners just as uneasy as it has for me after so many years. For some background, I trained officers in firearms as well as physical and verbal de-escalation for several years and called that line of work home for over a decade. I have been all throughout the PNW wilderness since I could walk, just like my father, his father, and all those before them. I suppose the reason I bring that up is to explain that I don't spook easily. My wife had just entered her 2nd trimester with our first child in the summer of 2018. While elated for the upcoming arrival, a little part of us mourned the freedom we had as non-parents, soon to be lost to time. So on our 2nd anniversary, we decided to go on a camping trip, which turned out to be the last time we ever did. Nature, the outdoors, deep in the woods, that is where I've always felt at peace. So it may come as no surprise to hear that when we go camping, we don't use traditional campgrounds. Instead, we take old logging roads, drive out to a place where we won't see another soul, and make a camp area of our own. We had a little spot near a steady creek deep into Olympic National Park that we had frequented in the past, and because we foolishly didn't take a half day at work that Friday, we figured why not head there since we knew the way well enough, even in the dark? What we weren't aware of was that a wildfire had ripped its way through that area, and the Department of Natural Resources had closed most of it off. With summer at its end, the earlier occurrence of the darkness of night made navigating a new spot, especially without cell service to pull up an alternative destination, much too difficult with 2 dogs and a pregnant wife all needing to pee while we drove down bumpy dirt roads. After driving around for a little longer, we came across a locked logging access gate that was several yards away from the main logging road we had been on. It was all fresh gravel that made a unique crunch sound as it settled under the weight of the tires. We figured I'd throw the gear in the canopy-covered truck bed inside the cab, and the 4 of us would cram into the bed for an impromptu setup. I made sure to lock the truck up and check that the locking gas cap hadn't come loose from the bumpy drive. It's one of those caps that makes an oddly satisfying clicking sound like an old safe when you turn it. The only supplies outside of the truck were a couple of pieces of firewood under a tarp, and we settled in for the night. An important side note, sleeping in the back of a canopied truck bed has a shortcoming in terms of safety and security. You can only lock it from the outside, so from the inside, you aren't able to. We were miles away from any civilization, hadn't seen a single vehicle or person on the way up, had a Rottweiler and a Mastiff who are both trained in German K9 work tucked in with us, and my 9mm Ruger resting neatly on the wheel well on my side. We were safe, well, at least we thought we were. Around 1 a.m., I awoke to the very low and very quiet sound of my Rottweiler growling. He was so quiet that even in the silence of the night, I could barely make it out from so much as 3 feet away. I leaned over and gently placed my hand on his back, letting him know it's alright and that there is nothing to worry about, thinking there were elk or deer walking in the brush or down the road. Little did I know how wrong I was. Through the dark tinted windows at the side of the canopy, a small light nearly pressed against it flicked on and then off. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It came to a full stop. The sound of a very deliberate repositioning of a large man's stance shattered whatever feeling of security I had left as the gravel shifted under his feet. This wasn't a trick of the eye or my mind making things up. Someone was out there. With my hand still on my dog's back, he quieted as we both watched the area where the flashlight was. Our heads snapped to the left when we heard the gravel shift yet again, but this time at the back of the canopy. The man hadn't walked. There were two. In the line of work I was in, you learn not to panic. You just observe and think objectively and let the adrenaline dump cripple you later. As corny as it sounds, my Rottweiler and I did what we were trained for. We stayed calm and tried to figure out what was happening so we knew what to prepare for. Thoughts should have been racing, but, as dumb as it sounds, time really did seem to slow down. I reached for my holster sitting beside me, and as quietly as I could, I pulled the pistol out and held it tucked to my chest. With the new roles of being both a husband and soon-to-be father, I was more terrified than I've ever been in my life. This wasn't just me doing dumb shit that could get myself in a bind or hurt now. I had a family, one that I, and apparently my Rottweiler, would do anything to keep safe. After years of training officers on threat assessment and qualifying for duty with firearms, I never thought I'd have to use those things outside of work. You might be thinking, well, why not a ranger? Someone with DNR because of the recent fire? I asked myself the same thing. The problem is that lights from a vehicle off the main road would have entered the canopy window and blared right to where I was lying. A car door shutting, two men walking on loose gravel all the way to our truck, these are all things I would have heard, especially since what did wake me was such a quiet and low whisper of a growl from my good boy. A ranger, law enforcement, DNR, or anyone there for a legitimate and non-ill-intentioned reason would have knocked, used the flashlight to look at the license plate number, and not used every bit of agility to silently creep up on a vehicle in the absolute middle of the woods at 1 a.m. What about someone looking to score a bit of gas or a truck? The gas cap locks and makes a very distinct sound, as I mentioned earlier. The truck was fairly new at that point, so the door handles were stiff and would have also made a considerable amount of noise that echoed in the canopy and truck bed like a noise chamber. Neither those sounds nor the tarp being lifted to be checked out happened. What we did hear next, though, threw out any and all questions and what-ifs. The very clear sound of a few words and low whispers and the shift of a long gun in someone's hands. Whoever they weren't here to check on us, to help us, or to steal from us. No, they were here for something much, much worse. I gently nudged my new and pregnant wife, and after I put my hand near her mouth so she wouldn't speak and alert them, I leaned closer to her and said words that felt surreal. There are two men outside. They have a gun. Don't talk, just nod. Do you remember how to take the safety off? My wife and I are polar opposites. I'm quiet and reserved, and she is the loud social butterfly. In that moment, though, she knew how bad this was. I could just make out the faint gesture of a nod up and down and the paralyzing fear that had consumed her into the freeze option of fight, flight, or freeze. If they open the canopy, if I drop the gun, shoot until the mag is empty. It was an awful feeling, knowing that we both knew what I meant by if I drop the gun. Knowing that it was a dance around saying if they shot me before I could shoot them, I never, ever want to have that feeling again. We sat in fear and silence. The thoughts of losing my wife, our child, and my dog, what would happen, how is this actually happening at all, knowing that I'd be arrested and likely harm my chances at transferring to a new agency in a few months, that I might have to take a life tonight. All the important things and all the unimportant things filled the void, the silence. I wish I could tell you there was some heroic ending. Some mixing up and a good laugh at my overprotective new husband/dad mentality. A curious critter is just sniffing out the foreign visitors. I think what bothers me the most about that night is that even after hours of waiting for what felt like certain death, just as I didn't hear them arrive, I didn't hear them leave either. We stayed up all night until the sun rose, and I have no idea when or where they went. When I had the courage to open the canopy and see if they were truly gone, the only thing that remained was a question I still ask myself all these years later. What did they have planned? Scariest night of my life. This is a story. I always get goosebumps while remembering, but I told a lot of people about it. First, I want to introduce myself. I am a 20M from Serbia. This story happened around 6 or 5 years ago. So I was around 14 or 15 years old. I live in a rural part of Serbia, but not rural enough to say that anything can happen. It's just that we are around 25 kilometers away from the nearest town. In Serbia we have villages, which I live in, and they aren't really villages, as most of the people from there work in some industry, and almost all of them have small gardens they do on the side. But in terms of the number of people, it's not that many, so in a sense, it's rural, if you can imagine. So around that time, my close friend and I would ride bikes all day long and all night long. We were at that point everywhere anyone could have been and knew a very large area. I am just going to say we rode bikes for more than 50 kilometers every day for around a few years, except in winter, of course. So the story starts with us being bored on summer vacation, and there is a tradition that almost all villages have football tournaments in the summer, and it would take around 7 to 10 days to finish depending on the number of teams that are submitted. So we had already gone to a number of them. Nothing would be different than normal because it was the road we knew, the people we knew, and it would just be a normal stroll. So what we did was we would go around 6 p.m., and it would take us around 40 minutes to get there. There were two options for how to get there. It's the main road that was a lot longer, around 30 minutes more, because it was going around hills and forests. And the second road that was going through the forest. We chose the one through the forest not because we were fearless or anything like that, but it was for safety reasons. The main road had asphalt but not lights, and we didn't have lights on our bikes. They would always get lost since we ride bikes off-road, and a lot of heavy trucks use that road, and it would be easy for them to kill us, so we chose the second road with that thinking because we don't have any dangerous wildlife, we thought it would be safest. We go a few times, and nothing weird happens. While nothing happened, I want to describe a road to you. From my house to my friend's house, it was the main road. We lived around 5 minutes from each other on bikes, of course. It's a small downhill from my house to his, and from his house we would go on another main road to another neighboring village. That road goes like this, a huge downhill close to his house, then we pass the church. The church is on a bit of a flat part of the hill, then another downhill up to the bridge on a small stream, and from there it's a big uphill to the neighboring village. From there it was a flat ride until we changed roads to a rural part. This road was used by tractors. Then we would go downhill past the little stream and go on steep uphill, and from there it would be flat for around 3 kilometers. There was no forest on the flat part, it was a field of wheat and corn. But from the downhill, there was only very thick forest. The downhill was very long, around 7 kilometers, and then we would come across the first houses of our destination. During the day, it was not scary at all, even I would say it's a beautiful road, which we used before for our rides. This road was very much known to us from a long time ago. A few details: there are a lot of headstones on this road because a lot of people died there while falling down trees. And a few graveyards were on that road, but we were never scared of it. There were a few stories around the bridge between our village and the first neighboring village where we passed the church. Stories were usually about a drunk man who would disappear and would find him a few days later all bloody and scratched, and he would say that some creature was on his shoulders and was choking him. But you can imagine how those stories from a drunk man may seem false. So that was all of the description for the situation and environment. Now what happened? When the tournament started, the moon was full, and we could see everything without lights, and while going home, we would hear all the animals around us. Some were howls, crickets, foxes, and dogs in a village, and so on, even though we were going home every night around 1 to 2 a.m. But something changed when it started getting darker. First, we started hearing steps behind us around 10 meters away at first and were off-road, so we thought it was some animal, but we checked a few times, and there was nothing there except I would say a chasm because if you fell, it would be hard to come back up. I can even say that if you fell and didn't hit any trees, you would fall directly on rocks and probably die. So we came home and didn't think much of it. Then, as there was less and less light, the steps became closer and closer. I will skip a few nights because nothing happened as we were talking. Do not get scared. The last night was hell. Before we got out of the village, my friend stopped me and said this to me: "Whatever you do, do not look behind us tonight. If you see something, do not pay any mind, just go your way, and if you feel scared, pray, and everything will be alright." He at that time had already read a Bible a few times and was a believer. I was a believer too, but I never gave it much thought, like I believed because of tradition. So I said to him, "Everything will be fine either way, but I will do as you say." I believed in my friend because he never lied to me even though we knew each other for around 10 years. We then started going uphill to get home. This way took us around 1 hour and 30 minutes to get back because now all downhill when we came was uphill. From the moment we stepped out of the light that was behind us, but now it was a meter behind us, we could feel it. All we know is that it was something big and heavy, and it sounded like it had hooves. The feeling was like a large cow was behind us, but it didn't have 4 legs. It had a weird rhythm, like it was walking on 2 legs, but the ground was shaking with each step, and when I say shake, I mean it. We could feel vibrations clearly. We were frozen solid even though it was 30 degrees Celsius outside, and everything got quiet except the steps. There were no animals, no insects, no dogs, no nothing. That thing was following us around for 1 hour non-stop, and that hour was like years. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't have looked back because I was so scared. All we did was walk in silence, and we didn't let any other sound, even breathing, be as quiet as a night. When we finally got to the first village, we were white and cold to the touch, while everything else was warm. We then got to one public water faucet, washed our faces and hands because we wanted to get some of the heat on us. Then we sat under a streetlight for around 20 minutes to get us normal again. We were so happy that we were, first of all, alive, and then we started going for one last part, which is the road where that bridge is, and up ahead is the church. Before we left the last streetlight, my friend told me, "Listen, now is the hardest part. The bridge is a turning point. If we see something or anything, this is a plan. We are going downhill and don't stop even if you can't pedal anymore. Don't stop until you reach the church. If I am not there, go to church immediately. If you see something on the way down, don't pay any attention and just go your way. After that, if God allows us, we'll meet before church and go together. If anything goes down." I just nodded, and we got going. We were side by side, saw nothing, crossed the bridge, and stopped before church because we couldn't have pedaled anymore. We looked at each other and started going ahead. When we took a step before the church's gate, we heard a sound, which I can't imitate or describe, coming from the bridge. It was like 100 people screamed and talked at the same time for around 20 seconds. We just looked at each other, from behind, nothing was there, and we slowly got uphill. We separated, and with the speed of light, we separated and got home. My parents were sleeping, and I just opened their door and said that I got home. When they saw me from waking up, the first thing they asked was, "Why are you so white?" I explained, and they just shook their heads and said that is what you get for going through the forest at 2 a.m., and I am lucky that I didn't see anything. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I needed to ask my friend what happened to know I was crazy, but he described everything as I remember, so we just sat down and were like, well, we are alive, so that is good. A few weeks passed, and I was, for some reason, going on that road alone also at night, but around 11 p.m. alone, and nothing like that happened, and later we also got together, and also nothing happened, so we used that road a bunch more times, and nothing ever happened like that. I don't know how to end this story, but that was it, even if it isn't anything grand and nothing actually happened. It's the scariest thing I've lived through. I believe God helped us. We were praying while walking, and that demon was behind us. Believe is a weak word. I want to say I know God helped us and that was the demon behind. When someone tells me that they don't believe in God but think there is something, I tell them this story and say to them, I was thinking similar to you before that happened, and I don't want anyone to go through it just for confirmation that there is a God and demons, not something. The whisper through my night shift. This is a simple one, but I feel the need to record it. It's been a while since I got a good scare during a shift. It was around midnight when I decided to do a round. If you've read my stories before, you know the drill. The school where I work most of my shifts requires that the lights stay off throughout the night. So, I try to do my rounds in the dark and as silently as possible. For me, that's the best way to quickly identify if something is wrong, and, lo and behold, something was. I was entering the largest room in the school, which reminds me of those used for dance classes. Wooden floors, a very wide space. I walked to the other end of the room, which is a dead end except for some bathrooms. Moving swiftly and staying close to the wall on my right, I passed by the female bathroom door. Suddenly, I heard a mix of a whisper, a moan, and a scream right in my ear. A shiver ran down my spine. Reluctantly, I checked it out, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back to the security room and texted my buddy, who had worked the previous day, to ask if anything unusual had happened during his rounds. I didn't tell him what I had experienced beforehand, but interestingly enough, he said that he had heard a mix of a whisper and a scream when passing by the female bathroom door on the first floor. Keep in mind, the room I was in was on the second floor. Honestly, I have no explanation for this, and I wonder if anyone in this world does. Let me know what you guys think, and thanks for listening. Night security guard. I used to work the night shift at UPS as a security guard. The security shed was at the entrance of the gate to make sure no one could get into the facility. The job wasn't hard. I was mostly checking seals on semi-trucks coming in, and when the shifts changed, I'd check in/out the package handlers working inside the facility. Package handlers would have to walk through a metal detector and scan their ID cards in order to enter. Their ID would make a green light go off when they scanned in, and we'd let them pass. If they didn't have their ID that day, they had to wait with me and my coworker while one of us contacted a supervisor or HR to let them in. One night, my coworker and I just finished up checking in and out a shift change. I was about to do one of our hourly parking lot checks when I saw someone approaching the shed. I yelled out, "Late today?" He said, "Yep," and I walked back in to help my coworker check him in. I don't know why I walked back in. My coworker could easily check in one late person by himself, but maybe because I yelled out to him, I felt obligated to finish our conversation. When the late guy walked in, I noticed that I've never seen him before, but new people come in all the time, so it wasn't a big shock. As he scanned in his ID, I noticed for the first time ever that the green light showed up red, followed by a loud buzz. Shocked because I've never seen an ID fail. Then as he passed through the metal detector, it went off near his hip. He showed us his belt buckle and said, "Must be this." The protocol when the metal detector goes off is the person removes what is setting it off and tries again, and if it is a belt buckle, they need to empty all their pockets. Against protocol, my coworker lets him in after he removes only his front pockets, but since his ID failed, we couldn't let him in anyways. So my coworker lets him sit down in the shed with us while I call a supervisor. None of the supervisors answered their phones, probably because a shift just started and they were busy organizing workers. A few futile calls later, the late guy said, "Hey, I'm going to be super late, can I just go in?" I said that he couldn't because I could get fired. He said, "No one is going to know." But then I pointed up to a camera in the corner of the shed looking at us. His face almost jolted to look at it. I told him that I would try HR. The night shift HR was a pretty cool guy that would shoot the shit with us on our breaks. He told us that a night shift HR worker is pretty much just a human complaint box. People just go to him to complain about other people. When he answered his phone, I asked him if he could come out and check the late guy in. He said he was talking to someone and if I could just tell him his name and ID number. I gave him the name and number on the late guy's card. HR told me he'd get back to me. While we waited, the late guy asked us if we had ever seen something crazy while working. I told him no, and my coworker told him a story about a guy with a hatchet in the parking lot. I got a call from HR, and when I heard what he had to say, I almost froze. HR told me that the late guy was actually an ex-employee. He was fired because he was involved in a violent altercation with a supervisor. HR told me to ask him to leave and to call the cops if he didn't leave. I didn't know what to say, so I made up a lie that there was only a new supervisor working tonight and no one could verify if he worked here. He then said, "Well, let me go get some coworkers that I know so they can tell you I work here." I again pointed to the camera and said that if it's not a supervisor, I would get in trouble. He then said, "How will I get paid?" At this point, I know he doesn't work here anymore, so I told him that I would inform them that he showed up to work and that they will pay him for a full day without him even having to work. Clearly frustrated and out of excuses, he got up and left. As he left, I noticed something in his back pocket. Something that looks like the shape of a small firearm or knife. Definitely not a phone or wallet. The rest of the night was normal. The next day I came to work, my supervisor was there too to greet me. He shook my and my coworker's hand and said, "Good job." He informed us that the guy from last night came back in the morning and crashed his car through the gate. I guess he was high on something, so when he crashed, he went unconscious for a while until the cops showed up. They searched his vehicle and found weapons, duct tape, and a shovel. Pretty much a murder kit. After his arrest, there was no further communication from him. I quit a few weeks later. I still can't believe I sat in a room with a would-be murderer for over 20 minutes. And I wonder what would have happened if I just let my coworker check in the late guy. By himself. This story took place when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and it happened in a house we lived in for about 2 or 3 years. For background, I'm going to give you the layout of my room at the time. When you walked into it, you saw a window that looked out onto the side of the house. That side had a gravel path and a big gate at the end of it. This will come into play later. If you look to the left, there was my bed and a window on that left wall that had a clear view of my bed and room from the backyard. I used to be an early bird, so I kept my blinds open all the time. One night I woke up at about 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom and get water. After using the restroom, I go to the kitchen to grab some water. The house was pitch black, and when I got back to my room, I set my water on the nightstand and lay down to go back to sleep. I was turned away from my window but could feel this presence behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling, and my curiosity got the better of me, which was a mistake. I slowly turned in my bed and looked up. At the window, there was a black figure with cupped hands pressed against my window, staring back at me. I was so shocked that I couldn't even scream. I turned back, trying to act like I was adjusting myself, but I crawled out of my bed and into the hallway to get to my parents' room. I told my dad, and he went outside, looking for whoever was at my window. I could hear someone running through the gravel path before he was able to go look, and my dad couldn't find anyone. I looked so scared that I think that's the only reason he believed me. He later told me that he does remember hearing someone running through the gravel and found shoe prints the next morning. I find it odd that whoever this person was, they knew we had a camera facing the front porch and found a way into my backyard without being caught or making noise, as my parents' room was toward the front of the house. So they would have heard him or her climbing the gate and walking in the rocks. Since then, there hasn't been a night where I haven't shut my blinds because that paranoia hasn't ever gone away. I know this story is short and not very scary in comparison to other things, but as a child, that was the most scared I'd ever felt. It's crazy to think that it still affects me to this day, and I'm damn near an adult. My dog keeps waking me up at night, but my dog died 2 months ago. I remember when it all started to happen, the nightmares, the sweating, the scratching, all of it. Each night the same thing happened over and over again. Why did this happen to me? What the hell did I do to deserve this? About a month ago, my dog Apollo passed away, and it nearly broke me. I know it may seem over the top, but he was my only family and my best friend. 12 years before I got him, my mom died, and not long after, my dad joined her. Life had been rough, and I needed anyone to help cope with the amount of emotions rushing through my body, and that's when Apollo came into my life. He was my angel, a blessing, and most importantly, someone to listen to me. He always seemed to sit and take in everything I ever said, and I never complained. He was my best friend. Anywhere I went, he came, and in return to listening to me, I gave him the world, but no matter how much I gave, nothing could take more than life. If there is one thing I've learned in my life, it is that the more you enjoy the things in life, the more life enjoys watching you suffer as it rips away what you hold closest. Walking into the living room to see the corpse of Apollo might have been one of the hardest sights to see. After all the crying, I finally managed to grab a shovel and bury him in my backyard. Each puncture into the ground hurt, but not as bad as each time I covered his limp body until there was nothing but earth below me. It took about a week for me to finally get back to a somewhat normal lifestyle, but the burden of my parents and my dog put a heavy weight on my shoulders. Everywhere I walked felt like I was carrying a life full of anguish and dread. The world no longer had color, and my soul no longer had life. I was done. I still functioned as a normal human would, but it got hard and slow with each waking morning. Every other night I would have dreams of me playing with Apollo and my parents watching. A big smile protruded on my face as I was in paradise, and for a moment I could swear that it was all real, but then I would wake up. This ever-going cycle of dreams went on and on with the same schedule: go to sleep, be in paradise, wake up to a nightmare. Sometimes I would wake up and swear I could hear the laughter of my parents with the faint bark of Apollo, but then nothing but silence. That wasn't until a month after these dreams that I noticed that the silence was beginning to break. One night after the dreams, I sat up in my bed and looked at the clock to see it was around 3:30 a.m. The blur of my once solidified eyes made it hard to see my surroundings, and the humming of the fan above reminded me of where I was. I felt alone within the dark void of my bedroom and reflected on the false memories I just lived in my head. I glanced around my room at nothing but darkness staring back at me and laid my head back on my pillow, hoping to revisit what I was taken away from. The silence of the night began to take me away when I heard something that went through the silence like a boat slicing through the waves. I heard a faint chuff from what seemed to be in my hallway. The door was closed, so it was hard to make out anything that faint, but I had sworn that I heard it. I shot open my eyes and stayed still, waiting to catch the noise again. A minute passed, and then I heard the quiet shuffling of something moving down my hallway closer to the door. It was slow but sounded as if it was creeping. The occasional tap of something that sounded similar to a nail of some animal hitting the hardwood floor echoed into my room. I listened with laser focus when once again I heard a chuff, this time to the left frame of the door. It sounded identical to a dog, but how could a dog have gotten into my house? The doggy door I had bought was programmed to only open to Apollo. A chip in his collar activated the door to open, but I had left the collar in the grave with him. Thoughts flooded my head as I waited for another noise to come from the other side of the door. Sleep was never an option, and I never got tired as the thoughts acted as caffeine. I wanted to say it was a dream and that I would wake up, but the reality was that I was wide awake, and most importantly, I was not alone. For hours I stayed awake until I could see slight rays of sun looking through my curtains. I decided to get up out of my bed and get ready as my feet rested on the floor beside my bed. As the hours had passed through the night, my worries had lessened as no other noises were made. Though I could not go to sleep, still I tried to be realistic, as this had not been the first time I heard noises just from my head. Just as I had heard what seemed to be Apollo and my parents each time I woke up, this was no different. Standing up from my bed, I began to walk to the door when I froze from pure fear. About 2 steps in, I heard a loud yelp followed by frantic scattering down my hallway. Whatever the hell I had heard was there all night. My body burned as I could practically feel the blood coursing through my body with rapid speed. The realization hit me hard, and I didn't dare move for what seemed to be an hour. What kind of creature would have simply sat in the same position all night doing God knows what? I finally built the courage to open my door to nothing but an empty hallway. Just as I began to walk down, my foot was met with a wet puddle. In disgust, I stepped back and looked at what seemed to be a water bottle's worth of slobber. Everything in my right mind was telling me that some sort of dog had gotten in and was lost, but I just couldn't see how it could be possible. In need of more answers, I walked further down, and everything was normal. Making sure to look over everything multiple times, nothing was out of place, and the doggy door looked just as it had always been. I wanted to say that it was all in my head, but the slobber was there, and it was very real. I figured that the best way to get past the night was to go through my day, and maybe whatever it was had just gotten lost and was now back home. Everything went as normal throughout the day, and I slowly began to forget about the events of last night. The thought of my family always seemed to help take my mind off of any situation. As the night approached, I turned off the TV and made sure that everything was locked. Once I was satisfied, I did my nightly routine, and before I knew it, I was fast asleep. Hours must have passed before I jolted out of my bed at the echoing of a howl. A deep howl that vibrated my insides and lasted for at least 3 seconds. The once normal day turned back into the nightmare I had gone through the night before in mere seconds. My eyes darted to the door as a terrifying realization came over me: the door was still open. The exhaustion from my day and the sleep that had been taken from me took a toll on my mind, and before I had the chance to close the door to my room, I passed out. Now I sat there looking at the crack that kept me safe from whatever the hell was in my house. Seconds that felt like hours passed, and I could feel the arms holding me up begin to tremble like the foundations of a building during an earthquake. My body began heavy, but I knew that any movement or sound could draw whatever howled closer to me. Just as the night before, I heard something scruffling around in the living room with the occasional chuff as I heard before. It was loud, very loud, and I could hear the table in the middle of the living room being pushed with cups shaking on top. Once again it howled with the same intensity and would pause, then begin to walk again. With all the courage I had, I quietly stood up and crept to the door with caution. I made it to the doorframe, scared to look around, but I had to get this thing out of my house. Everything pointed to it being a dog, which meant I needed to be careful, especially if it was a stray or a bigger dog that could attack me. With my heart pounding, I slowly looked around the frame to the dark hallway, which led to the lightly illuminated living room. The carpet seemed to have been moved around, and the table was now turned at an angle from the creature moving around. With a shiver running down my spine, I slowly walked down the hallway and could hear a slight painting from the right side of the room. In an instant, 4 feet from where the hallway opened up to the living room, a stench hit me so hard it made me gag. It smelt of rotten meat mixed with vomit and feces blended into a hell-bent fragrance. I stood against the wall for a second, having to take in the intense smells when the beeping of the dog feeder alerted my attention back to the room in front of me. Memories flooded in, as I hadn't heard that sound in the 2 months of Apollo not being around. I remember being fascinated with the technology of his collar as the worker at the pet store explained how the chip in the collar could activate the doggy door and the food dispenser when needed. Then the reality hit me: how could this thing possibly have that chip? The only explanation was that Apollo dug himself out of the grave and crawled back into the house for one last visit. This wasn't reality and certainly was the last possible explanation. This thing could have dug up the collar, but no animal could be smart enough to know how it worked. Surely enough, I heard the dog food being eaten after the shuffling of 4 limbs going against the hardwood floor. With even more questions rushing through my head, I continued my journey when a creak from the floor underneath my feet sounded like an animal. The food stopped moving, and then once again silence flooded the house. Then a shadow slowly made its way to the opening of the hallway and stopped just before it could be seen. Frozen with fear and curiosity, I waited with the hope that if it looked down, maybe it couldn't make out my surroundings. The shadow stayed there for a bit, then once again crept forward as I could begin to hear the slight breathing of the animal just on the other side of the wall. Out of the darkness, I could make out the end of a dog's snout as I started to hear it sniff. I slowly started to lean to try and catch a better glimpse, but within a second it loudly ran to the doggy door. With a fatigued reaction time, I started to run to the opening just to see the doggy door closing back from the intruder. I ran to the door and opened it, but there was nothing but the cold breeze to greet me in the night. Turning back to look for any clues, I saw it just as I thought, that a noticeable amount of food had been eaten and the smell was still slightly present from where the dog had been. I went to examine the kitchen and was presented with a steaming pile of feces left in the middle of the floor. Disgusted with the sight, I went to grab some materials to clean it up when I realized something odd. The shit was large, too large for a dog. Apollo had been a large dog, and I had to clean up after him for 12 long years, but this was something else. Everything I had heard pointed to it being a dog, but the human-sized feces confused me and creeped me out. Seeing that it was very late, I decided to ignore the strange sight and clean up, making sure everything was locked, and getting back to my bed. This time I made sure to place a nearby box against the doggy door to make sure that whatever it was could not enter again. Though sleep was rough that night, I managed to get a little sleep in with the extra protection of the box that served as a barrier for my safety and the dog outside. The next couple of days consisted of me trying to find explanations for the weird events of the nights before. How could Apollo be back? Was it truly him? Did something find a way to get inside? Maybe it was the deep hope of seeing my best friend again, but I knew that it wasn't possible. I saw his lifeless body on that floor, I threw the dirt on the dog that I once played with, and I watched as the foggy eyes of my best friend were covered by the cold earth. The days consisted of me asking the same questions, and the nights added more confusion to my life. I would go to sleep with my door closed, wondering if the intruder would come back in and make its visit, and it would take some time to fall into sleep. A single creak would wake me up, and sometimes I swear I could hear it back in my house. Some mornings I would notice the box was slightly pushed forward as if something was trying to get in, or that it had pushed it back into place so it would look normal. The thought of it being in my house as I slept never went right with my mind. Things seemed to slowly get back to normal, and just as always, the dreams began to come back with the same waking nightmare. I wish things had stayed that way. Getting back to my routine felt somewhat nice and brought some joy to my life that I hadn't felt in a long time. I came back to my house and sat on my couch with time to relax before the night was ready to take charge. With a little boost of joy, I decided to make my favorite meal and turn on my favorite movie. The day was the best one I had experienced since the last time I saw Apollo. After eating, I went to wash the dishes and stared into the backyard, thinking of how my friend was back there, resting, and hopefully at peace. I never looked back there since it only brought sadness to me, but maybe I could start thinking of it as a happy reminder of the good memories instead of the bad ones I had made recently. It was cold outside, and to be quite honest, ever since the dog was in the house, it creeped me out to go outside at night. I went to the light switch and flipped on the outside lights to get a view of the grave to maybe give me some good closure to end the day off. My eyes tried to adjust to the harsh darkness of the night when I noticed a small pile of dirt beside the grave. Pure fear engulfed my very presence, and I tried my best to understand. I ran outside the back door into the grave, sweating. There it was, the once filled grave with now nothing but earthworms at the once occupied space of Apollo. I had to have been in some nightmare, some long and descriptive nightmare made up in my ducked up head. The sweat dripped from my forehead and was caught by my nose, which made the sweat run to my lips. Was Apollo alive? Was he some kind of demon haunting me? There were no signs of a shovel but only the marks of paws or hands that formed the pile of dirt beside the grave. I had no idea when this had been done, but I wish I would have simply looked out sooner. Whatever was in my house was either some demented version of Apollo or something that had dug up his remains. Either way, I was terrified. The most gut-wrenching thing about the situation was that after looking around, there was no sign of Apollo's remains anywhere. I ran back into my house and slammed the door shut, panting and sweating with every possible thought clouding my mind. What I once thought was my dog now was something else, and it had been in my house with me. As far as I knew, it had been coming in when I wasn't even aware. Sleep was not even an option now, and I stood there thinking of how anything that had happened could be real. That was when the sound of a whimper made my blood turn cold. Everything in my body seemed to pause when I heard the quiet whimper of a dog, or something that sounded similar to one, from in the distance. I slowly lifted my head to face the hallway when I was met with the sight of half a human face staring back at me. I could tell by his height he was on all fours and was hidden behind the wall where only half of his face was showing. On his head was what I could only make out as the skull of Apollo with bits of his rotten flesh still holding onto the skull. The sockets were empty where the man's eyes could see through all the flesh, and he looked at me with a frown while still making a whimpering sound. Flies orbited him, and the smell slowly crept towards me just as bad as how it smelled the night before. Sensing the look of disgust and horror on my face, he quickly darted into the hall with a loud bash of his knees and palms smacking the floor. My heart bounded, and my knees felt weak as I had to grab the counter to help hold up my weight. This man had been in my house, at my door, acting like my dog, and he desecrated my dog's grave. I wanted to vomit at the thought of a man drooling on my floor and wearing my dog's rotting skin, running through my house just 10 feet away from me. I wasn't sure what sick game this man was playing or what mental state he was in, but my body refused to move. He had found this collar, which led him directly into my house, and acted as if he was my dog, my only friend, and found some sick pleasure in it. A scratching began to echo into the kitchen, and with what must have been pure adrenaline, I began to walk to the doorframe as if I had just learned to move my legs. I finally made it to the doorframe when I saw the twisted figure of the man scratching at my door. He was propped up on his knees and clawing at the door to my bedroom, panting, drool coming from his tongue and forming a puddle of slimy liquid on the floor. I could see the collar around his neck, tight and making his veins pop out of it. His body was dirty, and he was hairy. He was naked, and near his rear, he had the decaying tail of Apollo stapled to his back. Clumps of fungus could be seen stuck in his hair, and each one of his nails was long. It was the most disgusting sight I had ever laid my eyes on, and it took all my strength to not throw up on the floor in front of me. After looking at him for a couple of seconds, he faced me and barked. He began to shake his rear to simulate the wagging of the tail stapled on him, and through it all, he just stared at me. I had never seen such a human that had such features as a dog, yet there he was. Staring at him made it difficult to remember that this was a man, a grown man, acting like a dog. There was no telling how long he had been doing this, and he could have been here for weeks, watching me. I wanted him out of my house, I wanted to run him out, but this wasn't a dog. He was a full-grown man who could overtake me, and I needed a way to protect myself. I didn't have a gun, and the only thing I had remotely to a weapon was a kitchen knife, but I couldn't just take my eyes off him. Now that I had seen him, what would he do? He looked at me with such innocence, he reminded me of the way Apollo used to look at me. The man just stared at me, watching, waiting, and I did the same. The only plan I had was to run to the kitchen and get the knife. Anything after that would have to be determined by what the man did. The only issue is that if I approached him in the hallway, he could easily overpower me, I would have to distract him. Swallowing all the disgust, I decided the only possible solution was to play along with his little game. "Hey buddy," I said after whistling towards him, "Are you lost?" The man at the end of the hallway tilted his head with curiosity and responded with a deep bark that was so realistic it sent a shiver through my bloodstream. Looking around the area, I saw an old bone of Apollo's and quickly picked it up, showing it off to him. "Here, buddy. I know you must be scarred, but we can play now. Come on." After patting my knees to gesture to him to come, he slowly crawled through the hallway towards me. Slowly creeping back to make sure to stay out of his range, I continued to whistle and wave the bone at him. Watching the man come closer terrified me as the sound of his heavy breathing grew louder and louder with each thud of his knees to the hardwood. Now just a couple of feet away from me, I threw the bone as he tracked it and started to quickly shuffle to it. In an instant, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. As I ran, I could hear the man quietly giggling, trying to pick up the bone with his teeth. Just as soon as I pulled the knife from the counter, I ran back into the living room to see him turned away from me with only the sight of his hairy back, the tail, which dangled from scabs of blood from where the staple had punctured his skin. Without hesitation, I held the knife and, with as much force as possible, launched it into his back. With a loud yelp, he dropped the bone and crawled to the doggy door. Once again I ran towards him and punctured the knife into his flesh multiple times as blood began to splat and ooze out of his dirt-covered body. Nothing but adrenaline pumped through my body as I kept stabbing and stabbing while he attempted to crawl out of the door. With all my strength, I flipped him over and began to stab his chest and guts to make sure that I would end it for good. All those nights of fear rushed into me and drove my anger, which led to more push into each stab. Blood began to shoot out of his mouth, and the once innocent eyes were now filled with terror and the realization of death. I finally stopped and stood up, looking as he lay there shaking and gasping for breath against the amount of blood seeping into his lungs. "What the hell are you?" I asked, staring into his terrified eyes. "Your best friend. I wanted to be a good boy," he wheezed. I stared back at him for a second and wrapped my hands tight around the knife to give the final blow. "My best friend is gone, and you sure as hell are not him." Within a second I dug the knife deep into his chest until nothing but my breathing remained in the room. The nightmare was over. I got up and called the police, and they were just as confused as I was. They asked the same questions I had no answer to as we looked at the corpse of the man who once sat at my door waiting for some sick reward. To this day, I am not sure what made him do this or how long he was there. I continue to see my best friend in my dreams every other night, and I miss him, despite the fact that the dreams never ceased after everything. Life is hard without Apollo, and my parents and I would do anything to see them again. I wish those dreams could become a reality, but at the same time, From the reality I witnessed these past days, I'll stick with the dreams.